There is a version of Canadian history that begins with arrival. Ships crossing the Atlantic, men stepping onto shores described as empty, wilderness waiting to be named and tamed and built upon. That version is the one that ended up in textbooks. It is the one that shaped how Canadian cities were explained to the people who grew up in them, and it is almost certainly incomplete. Because if you go down far enough beneath almost any major Canadian city, if you follow the sewer lines past where they were built, and into the layers that existed before the pipes, before the foundations, before the first colonial street grid was drawn on paper, you start finding things that do not fit that story. Stone arrangements that predate European arrival by thousands of years. Trail systems that modern road networks were laid directly on top of without anyone acknowledging what they were following. River channels that were already modified. Shorelines that were already managed. Clearings that were already maintained. The evidence is not hidden in remote wilderness. It is not buried under ice or preserved in desert caves thousands of kilometers from the nearest city. It is underneath the cities themselves. Underneath the parking garages, and the subway tunnels, and the water mains, and the gas lines. It is in the soil profiles collected during construction projects, and then filed in technical reports that almost no one reads. It is in the anomalies that engineers noted in site surveys, and then routed around because investigation was not in the project scope. It is in the archaeology reports that were required by heritage law, and then submitted to provincial offices, where they sit in digital archives, accessible in theory, rarely accessed in practice. This is not a story about a single discovery. It is a story about a pattern visible from Halifax to Victoria, from Windsor to Yellowknife, that tells you something different about what Canada is built on than what the official history suggests. And the further you follow that pattern, the more specific it becomes. So let us go down. Let us go city by city. Let us look at what the ground remembers. If you are new here, welcome. These videos are long and slow and detailed, and they are made specifically for people who want to sit with a question for a while rather than get a quick answer. I do not rush these. I do not cut corners on the evidence. I try to show you the actual records, the actual survey reports, the actual archaeology notes, and let you draw your own conclusions. This channel runs on curiosity, and if you have found it, there is a good chance you have that same kind of curiosity, the kind that does not stop asking when the official explanation runs out. Drop a comment below and tell me what brought you here tonight. Tell me where you are in the world right now, what time it is, whether the lights are on or off, whether you are in bed or on a couch or driving somewhere in the dark. I love knowing where these videos travel. If you have been watching for a while and you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. This series goes into places that most Canadian history channels will not touch. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Now, let us start with the one that is hardest to explain. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and documented something extraordinary. He described villages, he described agriculture, he described a people he called the street. Lawrence Iroquoians, a distinct cultural group living in what is now the corridor between present-day Quebec City and Montreal, cultivating corn and beans and squash, speaking a language related to but distinct from the Haudenosaunee dialects further south and west. He described their settlements in enough detail that historians have spent decades arguing about the population estimates, and the numbers they land on are not small. The Street, Lawrence Iroquoian population in 1534 has been estimated at anywhere from 15,000 to over 100,000 people, depending on the methodology used and the scholar doing the estimating. They were not a marginal presence. They were a civilization. He came back in 1535. He made it further up the river. He visited a place called Stadacona, near what is now Quebec City. He visited a place called Hochelaga, near what is now Montreal. At Hochelaga, he described a fortified town with a central plaza, a population he estimated at around 1,000 people living there permanently, fields of cultivated crops extending out from the walls. His descriptions were detailed enough that later scholars have been able to map approximate locations and make reasonable guesses about the physical layout. They were not villages in the way the word gets used dismissively. They were towns. Hochelaga, by the standards of 16th century Europe, was a town. And then 68 years later, Samuel de Champlain travelled the same river corridor and found nothing. Not reduced settlements, not dispersed populations, not people who had moved inland. Nothing. No one who spoke the St. Lawrence Iroquoian language. No communities who identified with those ancestral towns. No memory among the nations Champlain encountered of a time when Hochelaga or Stadacona had stood in those locations. The St. Lawrence Iroquoians had vanished so completely between 1534 and 1603 that historians still argue about what happened to them. And beneath the cities that were built in the locations where their towns had stood beneath Quebec City and beneath Montreal, the ground remembers something that the official histories have been slow to integrate. In Montreal, when construction crews in the 19th and early 20th centuries dug into the ground beneath the oldest parts of the city, they regularly encountered unexpected material, refuse middens layers of ash, bone, broken ceramic, carbonized plant material, at depths that predated French colonial construction. Some of this material was collected. Some of it was published in the proceedings of learned societies that no one reads anymore. Some of it was discarded. Some of it was built over, and the coordinates noted in field books that are now in archival collections, waiting for someone to connect them. The pattern across these scattered records points to dense, long-term occupation of the same ridge and slope above the Street Lawrence that the French later chose for the same reasons: elevation, river access, defensibility, good drainage, proximity to agricultural land. The French did not choose that location because it was empty. They chose it because it was already clearly the right place to build a settlement. The landscape had already been selected for, cultivated, and managed by people who understood that geography, in detail, that only comes from generations of occupation. That is the first thread. It runs through every major Canadian city on this list. The colonial settlers did not choose their city sites randomly. They chose places that were already nodes, already recognized concentrations of human activity, already modified landscapes, already connected to trade and movement networks that predated European arrival by centuries or millennia. Understanding that does not diminish what was built afterward, but it changes the question from "what did we build here" to "what did we build on top of?" Let us go to Toronto next. The name Toronto almost certainly comes from the Mohawk word Tekaronto, meaning something close to "where there are trees standing in the water," a reference to the fishing weirs built at the narrows of Lake Simcoe's outlet to what is now Lake Couchiching, far to the north. The name migrated southward over time as French maps applied it to the portage route that connected Lake Ontario to the Upper Lakes. By the time the British established York on the shore of Lake Ontario in 1793, the name Toronto was attached to the general region and eventually transferred to the settlement itself when it was incorporated as a city in 1834. That etymology matters for what comes next, because a name that means "where there are trees standing in the water" is not a landscape description, it is a construction description. It is describing infrastructure. The fishing weirs at the original Tekaronto site were engineered structures, the wooden stakes driven into the lake bottom, at intervals calculated to direct fish into collection channels, maintained and managed by Wendat and later Haudenosaunee communities, over spans of time that archaeological evidence suggests run into the thousands of years. The name encodes knowledge of landscape modification so familiar that it became a geographic reference point. The portage route that connected the Toronto shore of Lake Ontario to the Upper Lake system, the route now roughly traced by Yonge Street, which Torontonians are fond of calling one of the longest streets in the world, was not a European invention. John Graves Simcoe did not survey that alignment because he was clever. He commissioned the road along that alignment because Indigenous guides showed him a trail that had been in continuous use for longer than most European nations had existed in their current form. The Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples had maintained that north-south corridor as a primary trade and travel route connecting the Great Lakes system to the interior. What became Yonge Street was, before it was a street, a trail. Before it was a trail worn into its current alignment, it was a route calculated by people who understood the watershed geography of southern Ontario in detail that European surveyors would spend decades trying to reconstruct. When the city of Toronto began building its sewer system in the latter half of the 19th century, crews encountered anomalies in the substrate beneath the ravine networks that channel through the city. The ravines of Toronto are not accidental landforms. They are the drainage channels carved by post-glacial meltwater and shaped by 10,000 years of riverine action, and the communities that lived along them before European contact used them the way urban planners use infrastructure corridors for travel, for resource management, for the seasonal movement of people and goods between the lakeshore and the interior. The ravine network is, in effect, the original urban infrastructure of Toronto. It preceded the city by millennia, and the city was built around it because it was already too significant a geographic feature to ignore. What the sewer crews found in the 19th century was not uniform, undisturbed soil. They found stratified cultural deposits at unexpected depths, charcoal layers consistent with hearth use, lithic scatter consistent with tool production, faunal remains consistent with seasonal butchering sites at locations throughout the ravine network. Most of this material was not formally collected or analysed. It was noted, sometimes, in construction journals. It was occasionally described to newspaper reporters, who wrote short items about Indian relics found by workmen, and then the items were forgotten, and the construction continued. The coordinates were not recorded with any precision. The contexts were disturbed before anyone with archaeological training could examine them. This is a pattern you will see repeated in every city on this list. The evidence existed, it was encountered, it was not preserved or studied. The official record therefore contains a gap where the evidence used to be, and the gap is sometimes interpreted as absence of evidence rather than absence of collection. There is one Toronto site that was studied, and what the study found is worth spending time on. The Boyd site, on the Humber River in the northwest of what is now Toronto, was excavated in the mid-20th century and produced evidence of Iroquoian occupation, longhouse traces, pottery assemblages, faunal material dating to the late pre-contact period, the 14th and 15th centuries. This is not surprising. What is more interesting is what the Boyd site sits within, a larger pattern of settlement along the Humber corridor that extends in both directions along the river, further than the Boyd excavation. Sites upstream and downstream have been identified through surface survey and aerial photography, but not excavated in detail. The pattern suggests that the Humber River corridor, now a green ribbon of parkland running through one of the most densely developed parts of Greater Toronto, was a settlement corridor of considerable duration and complexity before European arrival, and that the parkland which preserved it was preserved not because anyone recognized its archaeological significance, but because the ravine topography made development impractical. The archaeology was saved by accident, by a landscape too steep to build on cheaply. The archaeology of the adjacent, flatter lands was not saved. It was built over, and what was built over it is the city. Let us go to Vancouver. The University of British Columbia sits on a peninsula on the western edge of Vancouver, surrounded by Pacific water on three sides, and connected to the city by the land corridor of Point Grey. It is a prestigious research university with excellent archaeology and anthropology departments. It is also built, in significant part, directly on top of one of the oldest continuously occupied village sites on the Pacific Northwest coast. The Musqueam people, the ex-Methetikium, have lived at and around the mouth of the Fraser River and along the Point Grey Peninsula for a period of time that archaeological evidence places at a minimum of 5,000 years, and that Musqueam oral tradition describes as extending back to the beginning of habitable time. The village site, known archaeologically as DHRT4, the Musqueam village site, has been dated through excavated material to approximately 3,500 years of continuous occupation. It is one of the most significant pre-contact archaeological sites on the Pacific Northwest coast, and the University of British Columbia campus was built directly adjacent to and partially over it beginning in the early 20th century, during a period when the recognized framework for understanding BC Indigenous history did not extend to the possibility of settlement continuity across thousands of years. The university has made formal commitments in recent years to acknowledge and work with the Musqueam on the significance of that occupation. That acknowledgement exists. It is real. What it does not fully convey is the physical scale of what the campus construction disturbed. Because the Musqueam site at Point Grey was not a village in the limited sense the word often carries when applied to pre-contact communities. It was the center of a sophisticated coastal economy, a place where the Fraser River salmon runs, the offshore fishery, the shellfish beds, the camas prairie management, and the cedar forest management all converged. It was, by any reasonable definition, a node of urban-scale complexity embedded in a managed landscape that extended in all directions. The shell middens that remain at the Musqueam site are among the most information-dense archaeological deposits on the BC coast. Each layer of a shell midden is a temporal record, the accumulated refuse of meals and tool production and daily life, compressed and stratified by time, legible to trained analysts as a sequence of change across centuries. The Musqueam midden deposits at Point Grey contain approximately 3.5 meters of accumulated cultural material above the sterile substrate. 3.5 meters of human life, season by season, compressed into a stratigraphic column that represents not just occupation, but continuity, the same community, managing the same landscape, adapting to the same seasonal rhythms across a time span that puts the history of European settlement of BC into perspective as a very thin layer at the top. When the university was built, that column was partially disturbed. The portions that remain are protected under BC heritage legislation and are managed in partnership with the Musqueam Nation. But the full extent of the pre-contact landscape around Point Grey, the extent of the managed camas prairies, the clam garden structures along the foreshore, the seasonal campsites along the ridgelines, has never been fully surveyed. Parts of it are now under the Pacific Spirit Regional Park. Parts of it are under the university grounds. Parts of it are under the residential streets of the Point Grey neighbourhood. And the people who live in those houses are living, without necessarily knowing it, on top of one of the longest continuously occupied landscapes on the Pacific coast of North America. The clam gardens deserve a moment on their own, because they are an engineering story that most people have not heard. A clam garden is a constructed intertidal structure. It is made by piling rocks along the lower boundary of a beach's intertidal zone to create a leveled terrace that retains water at low tide. The effect is to expand the optimal zone for clam growth, creating, in effect, a farm that produces clams at significantly higher densities than unmodified beach habitat. The oldest clam garden structures on the BC coast have been dated to approximately 3,500 years before present. They are not small features. Some of them run for hundreds of meters along the foreshore. They require coordinated labor to build, systematic knowledge of tidal dynamics and clam biology to design correctly, and ongoing maintenance to keep functioning. They are, unambiguously, aquaculture infrastructure. The clam gardens along the Vancouver area foreshore and the Gulf Island coast were documented by researchers working in collaboration with Indigenous coastal nations beginning in the early 2000s. Before that documentation effort, they were known to First Nations communities whose oral traditions described them, and they were largely invisible to non-Indigenous researchers who were not looking for the possibility of pre-contact aquaculture at that scale. The structures were there. They were in plain sight, in the intertidal zone, visible at low tide to anyone who went to look. They had simply not been recognized for what they were because the interpretive framework that would have made them visible the possibility that pre-contact coastal peoples were engaged in deliberate, large-scale food production was not part of the standard operating assumptions. This is the recurring structure of this story. The evidence is often not hidden. It is often in plain sight. What changes the ability to see it is the framework through which you are looking. Beneath the streets of the city of Vancouver, beneath Gastown, beneath the downtown east side, beneath Yaletown and the West End, are buried remnants of a pre-contact shoreline that looked very different from the modern one. The Fraser River Delta has been building outward for 12,000 years, since the glaciers retreated and the rivers began depositing sediment into the Strait of Georgia. The original post-glacial shoreline was significantly further inland than the current one. What is now the downtown core of Vancouver was, 10,000 years ago, a tidal estuary. As the shoreline advanced, the areas of habitable land along it were used and managed by the coastal communities whose territory it was. The urban construction of Vancouver, from the 1880s onward, the railway terminus, the port expansion, the industrial waterfront, the residential development that spread up the slopes of the North Shore Mountains in people's minds, but actually spread across the delta terrain in all directions, disturbed pre-contact deposits wherever it went, without, in most cases, formal archaeological documentation. The regulatory frameworks that now require archaeological impact assessments before construction projects did not exist. Pre-contact archaeological material was encountered during construction projects and treated as curiosity or obstacle, not as record. The consequence is that the pre-contact occupational sequence beneath Vancouver is known in outline from the limited excavations that have been done at protected or partially protected sites, and largely unknown in detail for most of the urban area. What is known suggests very long-term occupation and a coastal economy of considerably greater complexity and productivity than the model implied by the word hunter-gatherer would lead most people to expect. Let us go east to Winnipeg, which has a different kind of buried history. The Red River and Assiniboine River confluence where Winnipeg now stands was a meeting place before it was a city, before it was a fur trade post, before it was a settlement. The geography explains why. Two major river systems converging creates a node in any transportation network that follows water. The Plains peoples who used those rivers, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Assiniboine, the Nakota, had been using the confluence area as a meeting point, a trading point, a seasonal gathering place for millennia before European contact. The archaeological evidence from the Red River Corridor in Manitoba documents human occupation extending back over 5,000 years, with the confluence area and the immediately surrounding terrain showing especially dense occupation signals. The Laurel tradition, the archaeological culture that produced the distinctive pottery found across a vast arc of the Canadian Shield, and its margins from roughly 200 BCE to 700 CE, has left traces throughout the Campri, Winnipeg region. Laurel sites are characterized by conical mounds, sometimes grouped in clusters, built for purposes that are not fully agreed upon, but that clearly required coordinated community effort and represented significant investment of time and labor. The mounds of the Winnipeg region are not as well known as the mound traditions of the American Midwest, the Hopewell and Mississippian mounds of Ohio and Illinois, but they are part of the same broad cultural world, a world in which landscape modification through mound construction was a widespread and significant practice across the central part of the continent. Several laurel mound sites within the current boundaries of Greater Winnipeg were destroyed by urban development without archaeological investigation. During the rapid expansion of the city in the early and mid-20th century, the mounds that survived are mostly in areas that were not developed, river margins, parkland, land that was too wet or too steep or too flood-prone to be worth building on. The archaeology, again, was preserved by inconvenience. The confluence area itself, the Forks, now a tourist destination and market space in the heart of downtown Winnipeg, was excavated when it was developed for its current use in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Those excavations found exactly what the convergence geography predicted: evidence of human use extending back approximately 6,000 years, the longest continuous record of human activity found in any Canadian urban core. The Forks site is now presented to visitors with interpretive panels acknowledging the Indigenous history of the site, and the archaeological collections from the excavations are publicly accessible. This is a relatively good outcome compared to what happened at most comparable urban sites. But the Forks is a contained site. What lies beneath the broader urban area, beneath the grid of streets and the residential neighborhoods and the industrial land along the river margins, is a continuation of the same story, interrupted and disturbed, and in most places no longer legible as a coherent record. The 6,000-year sequence at the Forks does not end at the park boundaries. It extends outward through the landscape in all directions, and the parts of it that extended into what became downtown Winnipeg are largely gone. There is a story specific to the Red River that most Winnipeg histories do not spend much time on. The Red River runs north, which is unusual. Most rivers in the interior of North America drain south and east toward the Mississippi or the St. Lawrence. Running north, the Red River drains into Lake Winnipeg, which drains through the Nelson River to Hudson Bay. That drainage pattern, combined with the flat topography of what was once the bed of glacial Lake Agassiz, makes the Red River Valley one of the most flood-prone landscapes in the continent. The communities that lived in the Red River corridor before European contact were communities that had learned, over generations, to live with that flood cycle, that understood which elevated areas remained dry, which low areas produced rich harvest after the water retreated, how to read the river's behavior across its seasonal range. That knowledge was embedded in the patterns of movement and settlement that the archaeological record documents. The settlement pattern in the Red River corridor is not random. It follows a sophisticated reading of the landscape that took generations to develop. When the first European settlers arrived and began laying out farms perpendicular to the river in the long lot pattern imported from Quebec, they were imposing a land use pattern developed for a different landscape onto one that already had its own logic. The flooding problems that plagued Red River settlements through the 19th and early 20th centuries were, in part, a consequence of that imposition, a failure to read the landscape the way the people who had lived with it for thousands of years had learned to read it. Let us go to Halifax. Halifax was founded in 1749 as a British military and naval base, a deliberate strategic counter to Louisbourg and a year-round Atlantic port. The British chose the site on the western shore of Chiboucto Harbour, a deep natural harbour on the Atlantic coast of what is now Nova Scotia, because it had excellent depth for large ships, defensible high ground above the waterline, and freshwater access from nearby streams. What the founding documents of Halifax did not record in any detail was that the site was not wilderness. The Mi'kmaq people, the Lunu, had been using Chiboucto Harbour as a significant seasonal location for a very long time. Their word for the harbour, Jipugtug, meant something close to the greatest harbour, a name that encodes a comparative judgment, the kind of assessment that comes from knowing many harbours and having a reason to single one out. The Mi'kmaq use of the Nova Scotia coastline was not incidental or sporadic, it was systematic. The Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, with its intricate network of sheltered bays and coves and river mouths, was a highly productive landscape that supported intensive harvesting of marine and terrestrial resources across a seasonal round that moved people predictably through the landscape. Fish weirs were a central piece of that system. Mi'kmaq fish weirs constructed intertidal structures made of wooden stakes and woven brush that directed tidal flow and trapped fish as the tide fell were present at numerous coastal locations around the Nova Scotia shore. Some of them have been documented, most have not been surveyed in detail. The intertidal zone, as anyone who works in coastal archaeology will tell you, is one of the most difficult environments for preservation and one of the least systematically studied in the Canadian archaeological record. The harbour at Halifax would have been surrounded by exactly the kind of infrastructure fish weir structures: seasonal campsites on the elevated terraces above the tidal zone, cleared landing areas, trail connections to the interior that the Mi'kmaq maintained throughout their territory. When the British arrived in 1749 and began clearing the site for the new town, they were clearing a landscape that was not unmanaged. They were clearing a landscape that was already organised according to a different logic than the one they were about to impose on it. The archaeology of the Halifax Peninsula before 1749 is thin. This is not because little was there. It is because the construction of a British garrison town in 1749 and the continuous construction on the same footprint for the 275 years since then has destroyed most of what was there before it. The archaeological record for the Halifax area concentrates on the periods and places where investigation was possible: shell-midden sites on the outer harbour islands, which were not developed as intensively, rock art sites and landscape features in the surrounding region that were beyond the immediate construction zone. What those surrounding sites document is a Mi'kmaq occupation of the Chiboucto area extending back well before European contact, a continuous seasonal presence over a long enough period to have shaped the landscape in ways that made the site attractive to European settlers for the same reasons. It had attracted Mi'kmaq use: good harbour, fresh water, good elevation, productive marine environment. The British chose Halifax because the Mi'kmaq had already identified it as the right kind of place. They did not know that. The founding documents do not record it, but the geography makes it difficult to read any other way. There is one specific detail from the early Halifax record that is worth noting. Among the first British surveys of the Halifax site, there are references to cleared areas on the slopes above the harbour patches of open ground that the survey documents describe as available for building without the preliminary work of tree clearing. Cleared ground on a wooded hillside in 1749 is not something that explains itself naturally. Forest succession on the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia without human intervention does not produce clearings. Clearings are maintained. They are maintained because someone wants open ground for cultivation, for gathering, for visibility, for landing areas. The clearings documented in the early Halifax surveys were the traces of Mi'kmaq landscape management, still visible 2 years before the British built their garrison on top of them. Now, Quebec City. This is the one where the underground dimension becomes most literal. Quebec City sits on a promontory of limestone above the St. Lawrence River. The promontory Cape Diamond, the rock that holds the Chateau Frontenac and the citadel and the Old City, is composed of Ordovician limestone interbedded with shale, a formation that weathers into a characteristic landscape of cliff faces, cave formations, and subsurface dissolution channels. Limestone dissolves in slightly acidic water. The St. Lawrence watershed produces slightly acidic water. Over millions of years, that chemistry has carved voids into the rock beneath Quebec City that are not fully mapped, not fully understood, and not fully closed to the public imagination. The upper town of Quebec City, Old Quebec, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the tourist destination, sits on top of several hundred years of colonial construction, on top of a much longer pre-contact occupation. Stadacona, the St. Lawrence Iroquoian town that Cartier visited in 1535, was located in the lower town area, below the cliff face, on the riverbank. When Champlain arrived in 1608 and established his habitation, he chose the same river margin location. The upper town, the fortified high ground, developed later. The archaeology of the lower town area has been studied in some detail, primarily because the historic built environment is so significant that any construction project triggers heritage review and archaeological monitoring. What those investigations have found includes pre-contact deposits, cultural material predating French occupation, at numerous locations throughout the lower town area. The street contact, Lawrence Iroquoian occupation documented by Cartier, left physical traces that can be recovered from stratigraphic context, and the pattern of those traces suggests an occupation extending back well before Cartier's arrival. Stadacona, in 1535, was not a recently established settlement. It had been there long enough for its location to be embedded in the landscape logic of the whole river corridor. The more unusual dimension of the Quebec City story is the subsurface one. The limestone beneath the city contains dissolution features that have been partially mapped but remain, in significant portions, unknown in extent. There are documented cave passages in the rock of Cape Diamond. There are historical records, from the colonial period forward, of workmen breaking into void spaces during construction projects and finding chambers or passages that extended beyond the construction zone and were investigated briefly and then sealed or built over. The pattern is not as dense or as consistent as some of the underground anomaly records from other cities on this list, but it exists. What makes it interesting in the context of pre-contact occupation is this: the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, like many northeastern woodland peoples, used caves and rock shelters for specific cultural purposes, for storage, for shelter during cold seasons, for ceremonial use. The rock faces and overhangs of the limestone promontory at Quebec City are the kind of feature that a community occupying the river margin for centuries would incorporate into their seasonal and cultural practices. Whether they used the dissolution passages, the cave systems in the limestone, in ways that went beyond casual shelter is a question that has not been formally investigated. It is a question that cannot easily be investigated because the areas where those passages might preserve cultural material are now underneath several centuries of fortification and urban construction. The oral traditions of the communities who came to occupy the Quebec City area after the disappearance of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, the Wendat Confederacy, the Algonquin-speaking nations of the Ottawa River watershed, contain references to the high rock of Cape Diamond as a significant landscape feature, a place recognized in the cultural geography of the region long before the French arrived. Significant places in Indigenous North American landscape traditions are rarely significant for purely aesthetic reasons. They are significant because they are associated with events, with resources, with roots, with spiritual practices. The specifics of what made Cape Diamond significant in pre-contact terms are not preserved in accessible record, but the recognition that it was significant predates French arrival is embedded in the landscape's own history. Let us go to Ottawa. Ottawa is Canada's capital, which makes its pre-contact history carry a certain symbolic weight that the cities on either side of it do not quite have in the same way. It is the city that Canada chose to represent itself. It is the city where the Parliament buildings sit on a limestone escarpment above the Ottawa River, looking across to the Quebec shore, asserting national authority over a landscape that was organised around very different principles for a very long time before Parliament came to it. The Ottawa River, the Kitchissippi, the Great River, in Algonquin is not just a river in the geographic sense. It is a highway. It is the main artery of the entire watershed that connects the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence Corridor, the primary canoe route by which people and goods moved between the interior of the continent and the Atlantic coast for thousands of years before European arrival. Every major colonial fur trade expedition into the interior of Canada travelled the Ottawa River. Champlain did. His successors did. The coureurs de bois who built the early Canadian economy did. They travelled it because Indigenous guides showed them the route, and the guides showed them the route because the route had been used, managed, and known for a very long time. The portages on the Ottawa River, the places where the river drops over falls or rapids that are impassable by canoe, and where travellers must carry their boats and goods overland to the next navigable stretch, are the critical pieces of that infrastructure. A portage is not just a gap in the water route. A portage is a place where every traveller must pass through a defined corridor of land. It is a natural node for trade, for meeting, for the exchange of information and goods. The portages of the Ottawa River were significant places long before European canoes needed to use them. The archaeological record from portage locations along the Ottawa demonstrates this clearly. Sites at portages show cultural deposits spanning thousands of years, reflecting generation after generation of travellers pausing at the same locations. The Chaudière Falls, the major falls at what is now the heart of Ottawa, just above the Parliament Hill promontory, were the most significant portage on the lower Ottawa. Algonquin oral tradition describes the Chaudière Falls as a sacred place, a place where the river's power was acknowledged and offerings were made. There is archaeological evidence of long-term use of the Chaudière area, consistent with the significance oral tradition describes. The falls also produced one of the most striking industrial erasures of a pre-contact landscape in Canadian urban history. The construction of a series of dams and industrial facilities, beginning in the 1820s, fundamentally altered the falls themselves, changing the character of the place that had been a sacred and significant landscape feature for millennia. The modern reconstruction of the Chaudière Akiko-Jiwan site, currently underway as a reconciliation project, is attempting to restore some relationship between the urban landscape and the sacred geography it was built over, but the falls themselves are permanently altered. The physical landscape that carried the sacred meaning is gone. What remains beneath the streets of Ottawa is a different kind of evidence. The limestone of the Ottawa escarpment, the same formation that holds Parliament Hill, contains dissolution features consistent with the Quebec City limestone. Voids, passages, dissolution caves at various scales. These have been partially documented in geotechnical surveys carried out for various infrastructure projects in the Ottawa urban core. The geotechnical reports are technical documents not generally circulated beyond engineering circles, and their documentation of void features in the limestone substrate is practical rather than archaeological. The question being asked is whether the voids compromise the structural integrity of proposed construction, not whether they contain pre-contact cultural material. Whether the cave and void features in the Ottawa limestone were used by pre-contact communities in the Chaudière area is a question that has not been formally investigated. The Algonquin oral traditions of the area describe underground features in the landscape in ways that suggest familiarity with subsurface space, a familiarity consistent with use. The specific locations of those features, as they survive in the urban substrate, have not been correlated with the oral record. That correlation has not been done. The expertise to do it exists. The will to allocate resources to it has not been present. The Parliament Hill site itself is interesting. It was chosen in part because the promontory above the Ottawa River was the most commanding elevated position in the immediate area, exactly the kind of position that pre-contact communities recognized and used for specific purposes. The archaeological investigations that were carried out in connection with renovations to the parliamentary precinct have found cultural material predating European settlement though the extent and interpretation of that material has not been extensively published for public audiences. The hill was not empty before it became Parliament Hill. It was a recognised place in a recognised landscape, and what was built on it chose its location partly because the geography had already made it recognisable. Let us slow down here for a moment and talk about the pattern. Because we have now moved through 6 cities, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Halifax, Quebec City, Ottawa, and in each case the same structure has emerged. The colonial city was placed on a site that was already a recognised node in a pre-contact landscape. The reasons for the colonial placement: good harbour, commanding elevation, river confluence, portage location, productive coastal environment are exactly the reasons the pre-contact communities had already recognised those sites as significant. The landscape features that made the sites attractive for colonial settlement were landscape features that had been used, maintained, and recognised for thousands of years before the colonists arrived. This is not a coincidence. It is not even a mystery, in the sense of something that requires an unusual explanation. It makes perfect sense that colonial settlers, arriving in an unfamiliar landscape and dependent on Indigenous guides and informants for navigation and geographic knowledge, would end up establishing settlements at locations that Indigenous guides identified as the significant places in the landscape. The question that follows from this, the question that has not been adequately reckoned with in Canadian historical consciousness, is what it means for the cities built on those sites. It means the cities were built at pre-existing nodes of human activity, in landscapes already significantly modified by human use over thousands of years. It means the colonial construction layers that we can see in the urban present are the most recent addition to a much longer sequence. It means the ground beneath Canadian cities is not the blank substrate implied by the founding narratives. It is a record. And part of what makes that record unusual is how much of it survives. Organic material in soil decomposes. Cultural deposits from 10,000 years ago are rarely the kind of material that announces itself dramatically to construction crews digging a sewer trench. But certain kinds of evidence are durable. Stone tool assemblages survive. Hearth ash and charcoal survive and can be dated. Ceramic fragments survive. Shell midden deposits, which are partly composed of mineral material, calcium carbonate from the shells, survive in conditions where organic material would not. Earthwork modifications to the landscape survive as topographic features, visible in LiDAR surveys and aerial photography, detectable in ground-penetrating radar surveys. Architectural features in stone survive. Drainage modifications survive. What does not survive, in most cases, is the attention of investigators. The material is there. What is usually missing is the institutional will to recognize it as worth investigating, the funding to support investigation at the scale required, and the relationships with Indigenous communities, without which the investigation would be ethically incomplete. Those 3 things, attention, resources, relationships, are the actual limiting factors, not the physical survival of the evidence. Let us go deeper on this. Let us talk about the Wendat Confederacy, because they deserve more than a passing mention in this story. The Wendat Confederacy, sometimes called the Huron Confederacy in older English language sources, though Wendat is the name the people used for themselves, was a political alliance of 5 nations, occupying the peninsula between Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe in what is now southern Ontario. In the period leading up to and through the early contact era, the Confederacy had a population that scholars estimate at somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people at its maximum extent in the early 17th century. They lived in towns, not villages, towns. Wendat towns in the early 17th century had populations ranging from a few hundred to several thousand people. The largest of them, places like Cahiage, which French sources estimate at 3,000 people, would have qualified as significant urban centres by the standards of many European settlements of the same period. They were built with multi-family longhouses, some of them 60 metres long, arrayed in organised patterns within wooden palisade walls. The walls themselves were not simple fences, they were elaborate constructions, sometimes double or triple palisades with watchtowers and catwalks, requiring the coordinated labour of large numbers of people and a sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture. The towns were laid out with open areas for community gatherings, with storage facilities for the winter food supply, with dedicated areas for specific activities. They were not permanent in the sense of being fixed for centuries. The Wendat practiced a form of settlement rotation, moving their towns every 15 to 30 years as the local agricultural land was depleted and the nearest forest resources used up. But the rotation was not random. The move was planned years in advance. The new site was prepared before the old town was abandoned, and the distance moved was typically short enough that the community's territorial relationships and social networks were maintained without disruption. The system of trails that connected Wendat towns to each other and to their trading partners to the north, south, and east was extensive and well maintained. These were not casual paths. They were travelled by large parties carrying trade goods over long distances, and they were maintained in good condition because the trade networks they served were economically vital to the Confederacy. The Wendat were a middleman society. They produced agricultural surplus and traded it northward to Algonquian-speaking hunting communities, who produced furs and other boreal forest goods that the Wendat in turn traded further afield. The trail network was the infrastructure of this economy. When the French Jesuit missionaries established their presence in Wendake, the Wendat homeland beginning in the 1620s, they did not find a sparse, scattered population. They found a densely settled agricultural landscape with organized towns, maintained roads, managed fields, and a sophisticated political system capable of conducting diplomacy with multiple European powers simultaneously while managing internal conflicts between the Confederacy's member nations. The Jesuits' own letters, the relations, the annual reports they sent back to France contain detailed descriptions of Wendat society that, read carefully, describe something that is more complex than the word tribe implies. The Wendat Confederacy was effectively destroyed between 1648 and 1650 in the conflicts now called the Beaver Wars, a devastating series of attacks by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, supplied with European weapons through the Dutch trade network, that scattered the Wendat population and destroyed the towns of Wendake. Survivors fled in multiple directions, some to Quebec City, where a Wendat community persists today at Wendake, Quebec, some westward and northward to merge with other Algonquian nations, some southward into what is now Ohio. The landscape of Wendake, the peninsula between Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe, was emptied in the space of 2 years, after 1,500 or more years of continuous occupation. When British settlers began moving into the southern Ontario interior in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they found that landscape apparently empty. The farms they established, the towns they built, the roads they laid out, they were imposed on a landscape that showed no obvious signs of the civilization that had filled it 70 years before. The towns were burned, the longhouses were rotted, the palisades were fallen and overgrown. The fields had been reclaimed by forest succession over 3 generations. But the trails remained, the portages remained, the cleared landing spots on the riverbanks remained. The knowledge of where the terrain was navigable and where it was not remained in the memories of the Algonquian communities who had traded with the Wendat and who continued to use the landscape. And when British settlers built roads across southern Ontario, they very often built them on the traces of Wendat trails because the Wendat had already solved the routing problem. They had already identified the path of least resistance across that terrain, the crossings where the rivers were fordable, the ridges where the watershed divides created natural passage. The modern road network of southern Ontario is, in significant part, the Wendat Trail network paved over. Beneath the farmland of southern Ontario, the farmland that extends in all directions from the modern cities, there are buried Wendat town sites, some of them known and partially documented, many of them not. The Ontario Provincial Site Registry contains hundreds of registered archaeological sites in the former Wendat homeland, but registration does not mean investigation. It means a location has been identified as probably significant. The investigations that would tell you in detail what those sites contain, how old they are, what they look like, how they relate to each other, those investigations have not been done for most of the registered sites. The sites are there. The record is incomplete. Let us go to Victoria, on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. Victoria is a city that presents itself to the world as British. The afternoon tea, the double-decker buses, the formal gardens, the legislative buildings that look as though they belong on the Thames rather than the Pacific. The surface aesthetic of Victoria is European in a way that is more emphatic than most Canadian cities, as if the city decided at some point to double down on its colonial origin story rather than complicate it. Beneath that surface is a different story. The Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, had been living on the southern tip of Vancouver Island for a period of time that the archaeological and oral record places at well over 3,000 years. The site now occupied by the Songhees Nation Reserve across the inner harbour from downtown Victoria was a village site of considerable duration, but the occupation was not confined to that single location. The whole southern tip of Vancouver Island was Lekwungen territory, used and managed and named in detail across the full range of its resources. The Camas prairies of the Saanich Peninsula and the southern island interior were among the most significant resources in the Lekwungen territory. Camas, Camassia, Quamash, is a flowering plant whose bulbs are a significant food source when properly prepared. The Camas prairies of the southern Vancouver Island region were not natural grasslands in the way the word natural implies unmanaged. They were maintained. The Lekwungen and their neighbours, the Wasand Saanich people, managed the Camas prairies through regular burning controlled fire, applied at specific times to maintain the open grassland conditions that Camas requires and suppress the forest succession that would otherwise take over in the Camas prairies. Pacific, coastal climate. The Garry Oak Meadows, the distinctive, open woodland communities that are now celebrated by conservation biologists and are among the most endangered ecosystems in BC, are, in significant part, a product of that management. Garry oaks produce acorns that are another significant food resource. They maintain their open woodland character, the quality that makes them ecologically distinctive and visually striking through disturbance. Without burning, Garry Oak Meadows succeed toward closed forest, and the Garry Oaks are eventually shaded out. The surviving Garry Oak communities of the southern Vancouver Island region exist because Indigenous burning maintained them over generations, and they began declining after contact-era disruptions to that burning regime ended the management that maintained them. When James Douglas of the Hudson's Bay Company chose the site of Victoria as a trading post in 1843, he was choosing a location with excellent harbour access, fresh water, and open ground near the shoreline. The open ground was a Camas prairie, maintained by Lekwungen burning. He was choosing a site that the Lekwungen had already identified as the right kind of place, for reasons deeply embedded in their knowledge of that landscape. The Lekwungen were displaced from most of their territory over the following decades, through a combination of land purchases, treaties that the Lekwungen understood as use agreements rather than land transfers. In a fundamental mismatch of legal concepts and the simple pressure of European settlement that expanded faster than any formal legal process could accommodate. By the end of the 19th century, the Songhees village that had stood on the inner harbour was under pressure for removal because its location had become prime real estate as Victoria grew. In 1911, the Songhees were relocated to their current reserve across the Gorge Waterway, and the land they had occupied in the inner harbour was developed for industrial and commercial use. Beneath the paved and built surface of that inner harbour, now the tourist heart of Victoria, lined with restaurants and tour boat operators, and the Wax Museum, are the buried traces of a Lekwungen occupation extending back well beyond the period of European contact. The archaeology of the inner harbour area is complicated by the extent and depth of the construction that has occurred there over 180 years. But where opportunities for archaeological investigation have occurred, in monitoring programs associated with infrastructure projects, cultural material has been encountered at depths consistent with pre-contact. Occupation. The Camas prairies are gone. The Garry Oak Meadows are fragmented and declining. The managed landscape that the Lekwungen maintained for thousands of years exists only in remnants, in the small parcels of undeveloped land that conservation organisations have been working to protect and restore. What that managed landscape looked like, at its full extent, the scale of the burning regime, the extent of the cultivated Camas grounds, the full network of trails and management zones across the southern island, is something that can only be partially reconstructed from the ecological record and the oral tradition. The built city of Victoria stands on top of it. Let us take a step back and think about what this accumulation of evidence means. We have looked at 7 cities. The pattern is consistent enough across all of them that the individual city stories are almost secondary to the structural fact they illustrate. Canadian cities are not built on empty land. They are built on pre-existing nodes of human activity, in landscapes already organized and managed by Indigenous communities over timescales that dwarf the colonial period. The evidence for this is not buried so deeply or obscured so completely that it requires extraordinary investigative effort to find. It is in published archaeological reports, in geotechnical surveys, in colonial-era documents, in the soil profiles encountered during construction projects throughout the history of every city on this list. The reason most people do not know this is not that the information is inaccessible. It is that the information was never integrated into the narrative that Canadian cities tell about themselves. The founding stories of Canadian cities are stories about colonial establishment, about British or French arrival, about the choice of a site, about the construction of the first fort or trading post or town grid. The pre-contact landscape those founding stories were imposed on is acknowledged, if at all, as a kind of geographic backstory. The river was there, the harbour was there, and then we arrived and built something. The active human history of the landscape before that arrival is not part of most cities' self-understanding. That gap is beginning to close. The combination of formal reconciliation processes, changes in archaeological practice, improvements in survey technology, particularly LiDAR, which can reveal subtle landscape modifications invisible to ground-level observation, and the increasing integration of Indigenous oral traditions as valid sources of historical and geographic knowledge has produced, over the last 20 years, a significantly richer picture of pre-contact Canadian landscapes than existed before. Sites that were unknown a generation ago have been identified. Structures that were not recognized as human constructions have been recognized. Oral traditions that were dismissed as mythology have been confirmed by physical evidence. The pace of this change is slow relative to the pace at which urban development continues to destroy the physical record. In almost every Canadian city, there are construction projects underway right now in areas that have not been adequately investigated archaeologically. The monitoring programs associated with those projects are variable in quality and scope. The review processes that are supposed to ensure adequate investigation before construction are under-resourced in most provinces. The cultural heritage legislation that is supposed to protect significant sites has enforcement gaps that allow development to proceed in ways that damage or destroy the record. What is being lost, when that happens, is not recoverable. A stratigraphic context disturbed by a foundation pour is disturbed permanently. A shell midden encountered by a sewer crew and removed to a spoil pile is no longer a stratigraphic record. A hearth feature exposed in a trench wall and then buried under concrete is no longer accessible for analysis. The window for investigation is before construction, not after. And the political and economic pressures that push construction forward are not well matched against the often uncertain and underfunded processes that might slow them down for investigation. So the physical record beneath Canadian cities is being degraded in real time at a pace that archaeological investigation is not keeping up with. This matters for more reasons than historical curiosity. It matters because the pre-contact landscape that urban Canada is built on contains knowledge about the landscape itself, about how to use it, how to manage it, how to read its resources and its hazards that was developed over thousands of years, and that is not encoded anywhere except in the physical record and the oral traditions of the communities whose ancestors developed it. Some of that knowledge is directly relevant to contemporary challenges. The flood management knowledge, embedded in Red River Corridor settlement patterns, is relevant to Winnipeg's ongoing flooding problems. The Camas Prairie and Garry Oak management knowledge of the Lekwungen is relevant to BC's ecological conservation challenges. The salmon habitat management knowledge of the coastal BC nations is relevant to salmon recovery efforts. The knowledge is not gone, it persists in Indigenous communities, in oral tradition, in traditional ecological knowledge that is increasingly being engaged in resource management contexts, but the physical landscape record that corroborates and contextualizes that knowledge is being reduced. And there is a third reason this matters, which is the most fundamental one. Canadian cities exist in relation to a history that is longer and more complex than their founding narratives acknowledge. Understanding that history, understanding what the land was before the city was built on it, understanding the human investment in those landscapes over thousands of years. Understanding whose country Canada actually is, at a level that goes deeper than formal, legal acknowledgement, is not complete without the physical record of the pre-contact landscape. The archaeology is not a supplement to the history. It is a primary source. Let us go back to something specific. Let us go underground. Because several of the cities on this list have underground dimensions that go beyond the buried archaeology of disturbed surface deposits. They have documented anomalies in their subsurface void spaces, passages, structural features that the investigation record does not adequately explain. And while the explanation for most of them is geological natural dissolution features in limestone, natural void formation in sandstone, the pattern of where those anomalies concentrate, and the way they correlate with other evidence of pre-contact landscape use is worth examining carefully. Montreal sits on an island in the St. Lawrence River. The island of Montreal, is a geological formation that includes significant outcroppings of limestone and other sedimentary rock. The limestone of the island has the same dissolution chemistry as the Quebec City limestone. It is soluble in slightly acidic water over geological time, and it has voids. Montreal has a long history of underground surprises. The construction of the Montreal Metro, the subway system beginning in the 1960s, produced repeated encounters with unexpected geological features, including void spaces in the substrate that were not fully anticipated by preliminary surveys, and that required engineering adjustments during construction. The specific locations of the most significant void features in the Montreal Metro construction record are documented in engineering archives that are accessible in principle but rarely consulted. The engineering teams who dealt with them were solving practical problems: how to route the tunnel safely past the void, how to stabilize the ground, not asking historical questions about what the voids were or how they related to the pre-contact occupation of the island. The historical question was not in their job description. What the St. Lawrence Iroquoians of Hochelaga did with the underground features of the island, whether they used the limestone caves and dissolution passages that the island contains, is not recorded anywhere in the documents that survived. Their disappearance. The St. Lawrence Iroquoians are among the most thoroughly vanished civilizations in North American history. They are known primarily from a few decades of French contact records, a body of archaeological material that is significant but not comprehensive, and the absence of any surviving oral tradition that could be attributed to their specific cultural tradition, because the communities who might have maintained it no longer exist as distinct entities. The void features beneath Montreal cannot be attributed to St. Lawrence Iroquoian use without evidence, but they can be noted. They can be noted as part of a larger picture that includes the dense pre-contact occupation of the island's surface, the sophisticated cultural tradition of the people who lived there, and the precedent from other sites across North America of underground space being incorporated into pre-contact cultural practice. In Toronto, the underground dimension takes a different form. The ravine network we discussed earlier is not just a surface feature. The ravines are cut by streams that, in some cases, flow underground for portions of their length, either in natural rock channels or in engineered culverts added during the urban development period. The distinction between the two is not always clear from surface observation. Toronto's geology includes areas of limestone and dolomite, particularly in the western part of the city, where dissolution features occur at small scales. The Don River watershed, which drains much of the eastern Toronto area, has an interesting buried channel history. The river's path through the urban landscape has been significantly altered from its pre-contact course through a combination of deliberate channelization and the gradual covering of sections of the lower river in culverts. What the river looked like and how the communities along it used it before the urban transformation is a question that has been partially answered by archaeology along the preserved ravine sections, but is not well answered for the developed areas where the river was covered or altered. One site in the Don Valley watershed that has been studied is the Tabor Hill site in the Scarborough area, a late Iroquoian ossuary, a communal burial site that was excavated in the mid-20th century and found to contain the remains of several hundred individuals interred together in a traditional Feast of the Dead ceremony. The Feast of the Dead was a significant Iroquoian cultural practice in which the remains of community members who had died since the last ceremony were gathered from their temporary resting places and interred together in a communal ossuary. The ceremony involved large-scale social participation. Communities from a wide area came together for the event, and the ossuaries it produced are among the most archaeologically significant pre-contact sites in southern Ontario. The Tabor Hill site is now marked with a small provincial plaque in a residential neighbourhood. The plaque is easy to miss. The site is preserved in a small parkette surrounded by housing. The several hundred individuals buried there are acknowledged in the formal record of the province. But most of the people who live in the surrounding neighbourhood do not know that the parkette at the end of their street contains the largest known pre-contact communal burial site in the Toronto area, a site that speaks to the density and complexity of the Iroquoian occupation of the Don Valley watershed and to the social networks that connected communities across the whole of southern Ontario. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the cities on this list. The evidence is present. It is in the physical landscape. It is sometimes formally marked. It is rarely well integrated into the stories the cities tell about themselves. Let us go to the one city we have not visited yet, the one whose underground dimensions are perhaps the most physically dramatic. Calgary sits at the point where the Bow River emerges from the Rocky Mountains foothills onto the Alberta prairies. It is a relatively young city by Canadian standards. It grew from a northwest mounted police fort, established in 1875, to a major urban centre in the space of about a century, driven by the cattle industry and then the oil industry. Its urban self-image is of a frontier city, a place built from scratch on open grassland. The story it tells about itself is almost entirely post-1875. The landscape it was built on tells a different story. The Bow River Corridor was one of the most intensively used sections of the Alberta prairies for thousands of years before European contact. The river emerges from the mountains with reliable flows fed by glacial meltwater, making it one of the most dependable water sources on a landscape where water reliability is a fundamental constraint on human activity. The confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers, where the mounted police established their fort in 1875 and where the heart of modern Calgary now sits, was a recognized gathering place for the nations of the Alberta Plains, long before any European arrived to mark its importance. The Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, had been the primary occupants of the southern Alberta Plains for a period extending back several centuries before contact, and the Bow River Corridor was central to their seasonal round. The buffalo hunting grounds of the Bow River Valley were some of the most productive on the northern plains. The Blackfoot understanding of that landscape, the location of the best buffalo habitat, the patterns of seasonal movement, the most effective hunting configurations, the locations of the bison crossings, where the animals were most vulnerable to organized drives, was detailed and long developed. It was knowledge that accumulated over generations and that informed the Blackfoot use of the landscape in ways that look, to a careful observer, like sophisticated ecosystem management. The archaeological evidence for pre-contact occupation of the Calgary area extends back well before the Blackfoot historical presence. At the confluence itself, and along the Bow River Corridor within the present urban area, archaeological investigations, carried out in connection with various development projects, have recovered cultural material spanning several thousand years. The Calgary area sites document a sequence of occupation that predates the current Blackfoot presence on the southern Alberta plains. Evidence of populations whose specific cultural identity is less certain, but whose use of the Bow River Corridor was sustained and recurring. The most striking physical evidence from the Calgary area is not a buried site, however. It is a visible feature of the landscape that the city was built around, or more precisely, built through, without fully acknowledging what it was cutting across. The Blackfoot, like other plains nations, had a tradition of landscape features whose locations encoded significant information about the terrain, bison run sites, ceremonial gathering areas, astronomical observation points, trade route junctions. Some of these features were marked with stone configurations that are now classified under the general heading of medicine wheels and related ceremonial stone structures. The concentration of these features in the Alberta prairies is significant, and the Calgary area has sites in its broader vicinity that represent this tradition. Within the urban footprint itself, the evidence is more subtle but still present. The alignment of several traditional trails crossing the Elbow Bow confluence routes used by multiple nations traveling across the southern Alberta plains, is preserved, in fragmentary form, in the modern street layout of older Calgary neighbourhoods. Not because any planner consciously followed them, because the terrain logic that determined the trail alignments was the same terrain logic that determined road alignments when they were laid out without sophisticated survey equipment across unfamiliar ground, following ridges, avoiding the wet lowlands, crossing rivers at their narrowest points. The trails and the later roads were both solutions to the same physical geography, and the solutions overlap more than a casual comparison of maps would suggest. Let us go to Edmonton. Edmonton is Calgary's northern counterpart in the Alberta self-image, the oil city, the gateway to the north, the younger sibling with less polish and more ambition. It sits on the North Saskatchewan River, at a point where the river valley cuts deeply through the prairie surface in a dramatic ravine system that runs through the heart of the urban area. The Edmonton River Valley is the deepest urban river valley in Canada, and it is this feature, the depth and extent of the valley, making it unsuitable for development through most of the urban growth period, that preserved the pre-contact evidence in that corridor. The North Saskatchewan River was one of the primary highways of the Canadian interior fur trade. The trading networks that moved furs from the boreal forest of northern Alberta and Saskatchewan, south and east, to the export markets, travelled the North Saskatchewan corridor, and the trading posts that were established along it were established at locations that had been recognised as significant river nodes long before the fur trade arrived. Fort Edmonton, established in its final location in 1830, occupied a terrace above the river at a point that archaeological evidence suggests had been a significant gathering location for the peoples of the area, Cree, Assiniboine, Nakota, over a period extending back well before the fur trade. The River Valley archaeology within the modern Edmonton urban area has been partially documented through investigation programs associated with the River Valley Parkway development, the extensive trail and park system that runs through the Edmonton River Valley, which the city has developed as an urban green corridor. Investigations along the River Valley margins have found cultural deposits spanning several thousand years of occupation, a multi-period sequence that documents the sustained importance of the North Saskatchewan corridor as a travel and gathering route. One feature of the Edmonton landscape that is worth particular attention is the coal mine tunnel network beneath the river valley floor. Edmonton sits on a coal-bearing geological formation, and from the 1890s through the early 20th century, a series of coal mines were dug into the valley walls and beneath the valley floor. Some of these mines were never fully mapped. Some of the workings ran under areas that were later developed for other uses. The geotechnical challenge of mine subsidence, the gradual collapse of underground mine workings as their support structures decay, is an ongoing engineering concern for parts of the Edmonton urban area. The mine tunnels are not pre-contact features. They are industrial-era constructions entirely documented within the colonial historical record. But they illustrate something that is relevant to the broader underground theme of this video: the Edmonton substrate, like the substrates of several other cities on this list, has been modified by human activity in ways that go deeper than the surface construction visible from the street. The underground Edmonton is layered: coal mine workings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, utility tunnels from various eras, and below all of that, the geological formations through which the river valley cuts, which include natural void features in some formations. Whether any of those natural void features were encountered or used by the pre-contact communities of the North Saskatchewan corridor is a question that has received little formal investigation. The geological survey work that documented the Edmonton subsurface was focused on resource extraction and engineering concerns, not on archaeological questions. The intersection between the geological void record and the archaeological occupation record has not been formally examined. Let us go to a city that almost no one thinks of when they think about this subject, but which has one of the most interesting buried histories on this list. Let us go to St. John, New Brunswick. St. John, New Brunswick is one of Canada's oldest incorporated cities, and one of its most geologically interesting. It sits at the mouth of the St. John River, the main artery of the Bay of Fundy watershed, at the point where the river discharges into the bay. The Bay of Fundy is famous for having the highest tidal range in the world, tides exceeding 16 meters in the upper bay, and that tidal dynamic shapes everything about the St. John River estuary and the landscape around it. The Maliseet people, the Wolastoqiyik, people of the beautiful river, had been living in the St. John River watershed for a period of time that the archaeological and oral record extends back over 10,000 years, to the period immediately following the retreat of the last glaciation. The St. John River was the primary corridor of Wolastoqiyik territory, a river system that they knew in extraordinary detail across its entire length, from its origins in the highlands of the Maine, Quebec-New Brunswick border area to its mouth at the Bay of Fundy. The St. John River estuary was one of the most productive environments in the watershed. The tidal dynamics of the Bay of Fundy produced and still produce some of the most significant marine resource concentrations on the Atlantic coast, including the smelt runs and shad runs that were staple food resources for the Wolastoqiyik and their Mi'kmaq neighbors, who shared parts of the coastal territory. The specific location at the river mouth, where fresh water and salt water mixed in the tidal zone, was a place of exceptional biological productivity that the Wolastoqiyik had managed and used for thousands of years. The St. John River, below the modern city, runs under the influence of the Fundy tides. At low tide, when the bay drops far enough, the river reverses. The reversing falls of St. John, now a tourist attraction, are the visual expression of this tidal reversal. The Wolastoqiyik knew the reversing falls as Manawaganish, and they navigated them, knew the timing of the tidal cycle well enough to time the passage of canoes through the falls at the brief period of slack water that occurs twice daily when the river and the bay are briefly in equilibrium. This was precise knowledge. Getting the timing wrong meant running into a violent rapid in the wrong direction. Getting it right meant having a clear route through. The colonial settlement, established at the St. John River mouth in 1783, one of the largest single loyalist refugee settlements in North American history, when approximately 10,000 United Empire loyalists arrived from the newly independent United States, did not arrive in an empty landscape. It arrived at a location that the Wolastoqiyik had been using for thousands of years, and that was already a significant node in the river system's human geography. The Loyalists built their city directly on and around the Wolastoqiyik use sites. The landing areas, the elevated terraces above the tidal zone, the cleared ground near the river mouth. The archaeology of the St. John urban core is, as with the other cities on this list, patchy, concentrated in areas where investigation has been possible and largely absent from areas developed before formal monitoring programs existed. What has been investigated suggests multi-period pre-contact occupation of the promontory where the old city stands, consistent with the Wolastoqiyik and earlier populations' use of the site. The geological dimension of St. John is particularly interesting. The city sits on a complex geological substrate, a mixture of sedimentary and metamorphic rock types that produce varied void potential, and the construction history of the old city includes numerous encounters with unexpected, underground features. St. John's 19th century infrastructure was built by a community that knew it was working in complex geological terrain, and the engineering records from that period contain notes on subsurface conditions that, read carefully, describe a more varied underground than the surface topology implies. There are documented cave features in the limestone and dolomite outcroppings on the St. John Peninsula. Some of these have been partially explored and are informally known to local speleologists and outdoor enthusiasts. None of them have been formally investigated in the context of pre-contact use. The Wolastoqiyik relationship with the St. John River landscape includes a dimensional understanding of the terrain of the caves and rock shelters and overhanging faces that is embedded in oral traditions and place names that were not systematically recorded before the colonial disruption of the knowledge transmission networks. This pattern of underground features that exist are informally known but have not been formally investigated in relation to pre-contact occupation is consistent across many of the cities on this list. It is a form of institutional oversight that is not active concealment. No one decided not to investigate. It is more that no one decided to investigate in a context where investigation was not a default expectation, where the resources to support it were not allocated, and where the interpretive frameworks that would have made investigation seem worthwhile were not in place. The investigative frameworks are now more developed than they were a generation ago, the resource allocation has not kept pace. Let us go back to the surface and look at something that is visible in aerial and satellite imagery, visible in LiDAR surveys, sometimes visible from the ground if you know what you are looking at, but that most people who live near it have never noticed. The earthwork traditions of the Canadian interior are not as well documented as the mound traditions of the American Midwest, but they are present, and their proximity to modern Canadian cities is worth examining. The prairie provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have a landscape feature that most people drive past without noticing, that shows up clearly in LiDAR surveys, and that has been the subject of periodic archaeological investigation for several decades without ever quite breaking through into public consciousness. They are called tipi rings, and that name, which is accurate for many of them, has contributed to a tendency to categorize them as simple camp markers, rather than what the more complex examples actually are. A tipi ring is, at its most basic, a circle of stones left where a tipi was erected, the stones having held down the edges of the hide covering. On the open prairie, where the wind is constant and strong, securing a tipi covering required a ring of stones, and when the tipi was taken down and moved, the stones were left behind because moving them served no purpose. Tipi rings are therefore time markers. Each ring marks one tipi in one location at one time. Over thousands of years of use of the same prairie landscapes, tipi rings accumulated in enormous numbers. Some prairie locations have tipi ring concentrations in the hundreds or thousands, the accumulated marks of recurring use over a period spanning millennia. The simple tipi ring is easy to understand and tends to not raise interpretive questions, but not all of the circular stone features on the Canadian prairie are simple tipi rings. Some of them are considerably larger, 10, 15, 20 meters in diameter, sizes that are inconsistent with tipi construction for practical purposes. Some are accompanied by radiating lines of stone, configurations that are associated with the broader medicine wheel tradition. Some are positioned at specific landscape features, hilltops, river bends, spring locations in ways that suggest deliberate placement for purposes other than simply camping in a convenient spot. The distribution of these larger, more complex stone configurations across the Canadian prairie is not random. It follows the distribution of significant landscape nodes, the same river confluences, the same elevated observation points, the same spring locations, the same bison crossing points that determined the pre-contact human geography of the region. They are, in effect, a map of the pre-contact landscape's most significant features, marked in stone, and some of them are in or adjacent to Canadian cities. The Medicine Hat area of southeastern Alberta. Medicine Hat is a city of about 60,000 people on the South Saskatchewan River, has stone feature complexes in the surrounding landscape that have been partially documented but not comprehensively surveyed. The South Saskatchewan River Valley in that area was a significant corridor for the Plains Nations, and the elevated land above the valley has stone configurations consistent with the ceremonial and astronomical tradition of the Medicine Wheel complex. The city's growth has not reached most of these features, which are on elevated prairie land that was never intensively developed, but the awareness of them within the broader public, even within the city, is limited. The Saskatoon area on the South Saskatchewan River. Saskatoon is Saskatchewan's largest city and has a pre-contact history concentrated in the river valley landscape. The South Saskatchewan provided the same travel and resource function in Saskatchewan that the North Saskatchewan provided for Edmonton. The Wanuskewin Heritage Park, north of Saskatoon, preserves and interprets a significant complex of pre-contact sites in the river valley sites, spanning over 6,000 years of occupation, including bison kill sites, ceremonial features, and campsites. Wanuskewin is one of the more sophisticated public interpretations of prairie pre-contact archaeology in Canada. It makes visible something that the broader prairie landscape contains, but that is rarely visible without the interpretive infrastructure. The city of Saskatoon itself sits on the same river corridor that Wanuskewin documents, and the pre-contact occupation of the area does not stop at the park boundary. The river valley through the urban area was occupied before the city was built, for the same reasons it was occupied at Wanuskewin, the shelter of the valley, the river access, the proximity to the prairie hunting grounds. Construction projects in the Saskatoon River Valley have encountered pre-contact material in archaeological monitoring programs. though the extent of the buried record beneath the urban area is not comprehensively known. Regina is the capital of Saskatchewan, built on flat prairie land around the Wascana Creek, which is not a significant river by most standards, but which provided the only reliable water source in the immediate area. Regina is one of the most dramatically flat cities in Canada. The land is so level that the grid of streets laid out on it stretches to every horizon without interruption by any topographic feature. This flatness, combined with the agricultural development that converted the surrounding prairie to cropland, has obscured most of the pre-contact landscape features that the area contained. What the LiDAR surveys of the Regina area have found subtle topographic anomalies, invisible to ground-level observation, but detectable from above, suggests a more complex landscape history than the flat prairie implies. Stone feature sites, low earthwork configurations, creek margin occupation scatters features present in the pre-agricultural landscape that were ploughed flat and buried by over a century of intensive cultivation. The Wascana Creek area, like most prairie watercourses, was a significant node in the pre-contact landscape, a reliable water source in an otherwise dry terrain, a wildfowl concentration area, a place where the seasonal bison herds came to water. The Regina area was occupied before it was a city. The evidence for that occupation has been largely destroyed by agricultural and urban development. What remains is present in fragments, in the small areas of uncultivated prairie that survive in the broader landscape, in the river valley margins where development was constrained by flood risk, in the archaeological record recovered during monitoring programs for construction projects in the urban core. Let us go back to the fundamental question that this video set out to ask, and let us ask it more precisely. When we say that Canadian cities were built on top of something older, what do we mean by something older? We are not talking about a vague, generalized, Indigenous presence that is acknowledged in a land acknowledgement statement at the start of a public meeting and then not thought about further. We are talking about specific things, specific physical features, specific cultural deposits, specific landscape modifications, specific architectural constructions, specific knowledge systems embedded in the landscape itself, and specific, named communities who created all of those things and whose descendants are still present, still living in relationship with those landscapes, still carrying knowledge about them that the archaeological and historical record cannot fully replicate. The something older is not abstract, it is concrete. It is the Wendat town at Kahiagay, somewhere under the farmland north of Barrie, Ontario. It is the Musqueam village at the base of the Point Grey Cliffs, preserved in fragments under the university buildings and the park. It is the Wollastockieck use sites at the St. John River mouth, covered by the old city's street grid. It is the clam gardens in the intertidal zone along the Vancouver area foreshore, visible at low tide to anyone who walks down to look. It is the Forks at Winnipeg, where 6,000 years of human activity was found 2 meters below the surface of a parking lot. It is also things that have not been found yet, because no one has looked. Things that are probably there, in the substrate of every major Canadian city, waiting for an investigation that may or may not happen before the development that would destroy them. That is the uncomfortable part of this story. Not that the evidence exists, though it does. Not that it tells a different and more complex story about Canada's landscape history than the standard narratives, though it does. But that the evidence is being lost, in real time, as cities continue to develop in ways that are only partially regulated by the heritage frameworks that are supposed to protect the record. Every foundation pour in downtown Toronto, every sewer replacement in Old Montreal, every underground infrastructure project in the Vancouver urban area destroys some portion of what is below ground. Most of it will never be investigated. Most of what is destroyed will be unknown before it is gone. The exceptions matter: the sites that were investigated, the deposits that were documented, the collections that were made and curated and made available for research. But the exceptions are a small fraction of the total, and that fraction is getting smaller as the development pressure on urban land intensifies. This is a solvable problem. Not completely, some of what has already been destroyed cannot be recovered, but the rate of loss is not fixed. It is a function of regulatory frameworks and political will and resource allocation. Cities that take urban archaeology seriously, and there are examples in Europe and in other parts of the world where it is taken seriously, integrate archaeological investigation systematically into development processes in ways that produce much better records than the current Canadian approach. The knowledge exists about how to do this better. The will to apply it has been uneven. And there is a dimension of this that goes beyond regulatory frameworks into something that is harder to legislate and harder to allocate resources toward, but that may be the most important element of the whole question. The knowledge that the physical record represents is not the only form in which that knowledge exists. The communities whose ancestors created the landscapes beneath Canadian cities are still present. The Musqueam Nation at Point Grey, the Wolastoqiyik in New Brunswick, the Lekwungen on Vancouver Island, the Wendat community at Wendake, Quebec, the Cree and Anishinaabe communities throughout the Ontario Shield, the Blackfoot Confederacy in southern Alberta, the Wolastoqiyik in the St. John River watershed. These communities carry knowledge about the landscapes their ancestors managed, the knowledge that is sometimes available in published ethnographic and linguistic sources and sometimes not, but that exists as living knowledge within the communities themselves. The integration of that knowledge into the understanding of what Canadian cities are built on is not a purely academic project. It is a relational one. It requires the kind of sustained engagement between researchers, municipal governments, developers, and Indigenous communities that is difficult to sustain over the timescales that genuine investigation requires. It requires trust that has to be built slowly, respect for the knowledge systems being engaged, and a willingness to accept that the resulting picture may complicate stories that some people would rather leave simple. But the picture is already complicated. The evidence already exists. The stories are already complex. The only question is whether Canada's cities choose to understand what they are built on or to continue building on top of it without looking down. Let us look at one more dimension of this before we get to the end. There is a dimension of this story that has not been discussed yet, and it is the one that most directly addresses the question posed in the title of this video. What, specifically, is older? What is it that was there before the cities? The cities are obvious. We know what the cities are. What was there before the cities? The standard answer is forests, grassland, rivers, natural landscape, and then people, Indigenous people, whose presence is acknowledged in increasingly formal land acknowledgements, but whose specific relationship with those landscapes remains, for most Canadians, vague and underspecified. The more accurate answer is managed landscapes, organized communities, sophisticated economies, political networks, long-distance trade systems, astronomical knowledge traditions, architectural constructions, agricultural systems, aquaculture systems, and accumulated ecological knowledge representing thousands of years of careful observation and active management of the same landscapes that the cities were subsequently built on. And in some cases, physical constructions that are still present underground, still present in the substrate of the cities, preserved by the same burial and sealing that the construction itself performed. That is a more specific and more confronting answer. It requires treating the pre-contact landscape not as wilderness, a word that implies an absence of human shaping, but as a humanized landscape, a landscape that had already been made by human labor and knowledge over millennia before European arrival. The cartographic evidence supports this in ways that the early colonial maps reveal if you know how to read them. Samuel de Champlain's maps of the early 17th century, particularly the map of 1612 and the later, more detailed map of 1632, encode information that Champlain gathered from Indigenous informants and from his own journeys through the landscape. The maps are sometimes treated primarily as geographic documents, measurements of coastlines and river systems, but they are also, embedded in their geographic information, records of the human landscape as Indigenous informants understood it. The 1632 Champlain map shows a network of trails and routes through the interior of what is now Ontario and Quebec that was assembled from Indigenous geographic knowledge. The routes shown are not European projections. They are the pre-contact movement network of the region, documented by Champlain through conversations with people who knew the routes in detail: Wendat guides, Algonquin travelers, Huron river traders. The map shows which rivers connected to which portages crossed which watersheds, which lakes were navigable and in what seasons. It shows the landscape as a network of human navigable routes, not as a wilderness. When you overlay that network on a modern map of southern Ontario and Quebec and look at where the modern cities are, the correlation is striking. The cities sit at the nodes, at the places where the routes converged, where the portages were, where the river confluences provided connection in multiple directions. The cities are not distributed randomly across the landscape. They are at the places the map shows as already significant. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require secret knowledge or suppressed history. It is simply the consequence of how European settlement happened through dependence on indigenous guidance in a landscape where European geographic knowledge was initially close to zero. The guides showed the settlers the best places. The best places were the places the guides' communities had already identified as significant over thousands of years of landscape knowledge. The cities were built at those places. That is the story the early maps tell, if you read them as documents of both the physical landscape and the human landscape that existed in it. There are also maps that show specific features that later colonial cartography stopped showing, or that were never incorporated into the later cartographic tradition, because the political implications of acknowledging them were too complicated. The Jesuit relations, the annual report sent from the Jesuit missions in New France to the Society's headquarters in France, beginning in 1632, contain embedded cartographic information about the pre-contact landscape of the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes region. Some of the Jesuit maps show features of the landscape that are described in enough detail to locate approximately on a modern map, and that have been partially corroborated by archaeological evidence. The agricultural clearings of the Wendat homeland, for example, are documented in Jesuit descriptions in enough detail to support estimates of the area under cultivation at the peak of the Confederacy's agricultural system. Those estimates are not small. The Wendat were farming thousands of hectares of southern Ontario, maintaining a caloric surplus that supported their trading economy. The landscape of what is now Simcoe County and Georgian Bay was not forest. It was a working agricultural system of considerable scale. When the Wendat towns burned in 1649 and 1650 and the population scattered, the agricultural clearings began their reversion to forest. By the time European settlers arrived in that landscape in the early 19th century, the forest succession was well advanced. 3 or 4 generations of growth, in some cases more. The land looked like wilderness. It was not wilderness. It was an agricultural landscape between cultivation cycles, a landscape whose biological productivity was still elevated by the soil improvements that centuries of Wendat cultivation had produced, but whose human organization was gone. The settlers who cleared the wilderness of southern Ontario in the 19th century were sometimes clearing forests that had grown on the sites of Wendat cornfields. The stumps they pulled and the sod they broke were not virgin landscape. They were the third act of a long landscape history, of which they knew nothing, and which the landscape itself could not communicate to them in a language they recognized. The soil remembers. The micromorphological analysis of buried soil profiles from the former Wendat homeland, a kind of archaeology that examines the physical and chemical properties of ancient soils rather than the artifacts in them can detect. The traces of agricultural cultivation that went on in those soils. Before the forest grew back and the forest soils developed on top, the work is painstaking and expensive and requires specialized expertise. It has been done at a handful of sites where the research questions were strong enough to justify the cost. What it has found, consistently, is what the Jesuit maps and the Jesuit descriptions and the pre-contact oral traditions all independently suggest. This was a cultivated landscape, and the cultivation lasted long enough to change the soil. The soil beneath the farms and suburbs of southern Ontario knows things about the land's history that the farms and suburbs do not know they are sitting on. That image, the soil knowing, the landscape remembering, the physical record persisting below the constructed surface, is at the center of what this video has been building toward. Canadian cities are not sitting on blank ground. They are sitting on a palimpsest, a layered document in which newer writing partially obscures older writing but cannot entirely erase it. The older writing is still there. It is legible, with the right tools and the right interpretive framework. It tells a story about this land, about how it was known, how it was shaped, how it was used, over timescales that make the colonial period a thin layer at the top of a very deep record. Reading that story is not simple. It requires archaeological investigation and geological survey and soil analysis and LiDAR imagery and drone survey and archival research and the engagement of living Indigenous communities who carry knowledge that the physical record alone cannot supply. It requires sustained attention and sustained resources and sustained relationships and the institutional will to treat the question as important enough to warrant all of those things. It also requires a certain willingness to be unsettled, because the story the evidence tells is not one that fits comfortably into the founding narratives of Canadian cities. It does not describe a wilderness encountered and built upon. It describes a humanized landscape with a long and complex history, encountered during a period of extreme demographic disruption caused by epidemic disease, political conflict, and colonial dispossession, and built upon by people who did not understand, who in most cases were not equipped to understand what they were building on top of. Understanding it now does not change what was done, but it does change what understanding Canada means. Let us keep going, because there are specific physical features that present in multiple Canadian cities, and that have been documented in technical reports and archaeological field notes that are worth spending more time on. Let us talk about buried rivers, because almost every major Canadian city has them, and they are one of the most direct forms of physical evidence that the landscape beneath the urban surface has a history different from what the surface implies. A buried river is exactly what the term suggests, a river that used to flow at or near the surface and now flows underground, either in a natural bedrock channel or in an engineered culvert. The process of burying rivers was a standard tool of 19th and early 20th century city building. A river that ran through urban land was considered an obstacle to development. It divided neighborhoods, created flood risk, and occupied land that could otherwise be used for streets and buildings. The solution was culverting, enclosing the river in a concrete or masonry tunnel and burying it under the surface of the developing city. Toronto has buried more rivers than any other Canadian city. The Garrison Creek, which drained the western Toronto watersheds into Lake Ontario through a deep ravine, was buried between 1,884 and 1,920 in sections. Its ravine gradually filled and built over. The old course of the creek is still visible in the street layout and topography of the West End neighbourhoods. It passed through unexpected curves in streets that should be straight, subtle valley-shaped depression in the terrain that the street grid imposes itself over without quite erasing. The Garrison Creek Streamway Trail, a linear park that follows the approximate course of the buried creek, was developed in the 1990s as a recognition of the creek's landscape presence, even though the creek itself is invisible. What the Garrison Creek Ravine was, before Toronto was built, is relevant here. It was a drainage corridor in a landscape occupied by Indigenous communities who knew it in detail. The ravine provided exactly the kind of shelter from wind, from visibility, from the elements that made winter occupation of the Toronto lakeshore possible. Campsites along ravine walls, protected from weather and hidden from view, were common features of the pre-contact landscape throughout the Toronto area. The Garrison Creek Ravine, before it was buried and its landscape filled in, was a corridor through which people had been moving and in which people had been camping for a very long time. When the ravine was filled, the pre-contact deposits it contained were either excavated and discarded or buried under the fill. There was no systematic archaeological documentation of the Garrison Creek Ravine before its burial. The burial happened before the institutional frameworks for such documentation existed. What was there is gone. The same story ravine occupied for millennia, buried during city building without documentation, applies to at least 4 other buried watercourses in Toronto, to multiple buried streams in Montreal, to the lower sections of several Vancouver area creeks, and to watercourses in every other city on this list that was built through a period of active stream culverting and valley filling. The buried rivers are significant, not just as lost archaeological contexts. They are significant because they were the arteries of the pre-contact landscape, the corridors through which people moved, the water sources around which camps were organized, the biological corridors that connected the upland and lowland environments. The pre-contact human geography of Toronto was organized around its ravine and river system. Burying that system, filling the ravines, culverting the streams, erasing the drainage geography, was a literal transformation of the landscape into something different from what it had been. Not just different aesthetically, different structurally, different in ways that affected the biological and hydrological functioning of the landscape, in ways that continue to manifest as urban flooding, erosion, and habitat loss. The cities built over those buried rivers are inheriting the consequences of having erased the landscape infrastructure that preceded them. That is a practical problem, not just a historical one. Urban flooding in Toronto concentrates along the courses of the buried creeks because the drainage capacity of the buried culverts is insufficient for extreme precipitation events that are increasing in frequency with climate change. The solution to that practical problem involves restoring some of the drainage functions that were destroyed when the creeks were buried, which in turn means restoring elements of the pre-contact landscape, not out of historical sentiment, but out of engineering necessity. The landscape knows what the city built over it preferred not to know, and the landscape is making that knowledge increasingly inconvenient. Let us talk about the stone features. In multiple Canadian cities, the construction of infrastructure has encountered stone arrangements that do not fit the expected geological profile for the area stones that are either non-local in origin or arranged in configurations that are inconsistent with natural depositional processes, or positioned in ways that suggest deliberate placement rather than natural occurrence. These encounters are documented in geotechnical reports, in archaeological monitoring notes, and occasionally in the memoirs and correspondence of engineers who were puzzled by what they found. In most cases, the features were encountered, noted briefly, and then built over because the engineering project was on a schedule and the investigation of stone arrangements was not in the scope of work. The documentation that exists for these features is scattered in provincial archives, in municipal engineering records, in the papers of individual engineers and surveyors who found them interesting enough to write down. There has been no systematic effort to aggregate this documentation across cities and time periods to look at the complete picture of what has been encountered and where. If that aggregation were done, the pattern it revealed would probably be similar to the pattern visible from other types of evidence. A concentration of anomalous features in the same landscape nodes that the archaeological and historical evidence identifies as pre-contact significant locations. The portage sites, the river confluences, the elevated promontories, the spring locations, the places that were already recognized as important before the cities arrived. The question of what those stone features represent, whether they are pre-contact constructions, natural geological features, or early colonial constructions, is in most cases unanswerable from the available evidence because the evidence that would answer it was buried under concrete before anyone could analyze it. The uncertainty is a consequence of the investigation not having been done, not a consequence of the features being ambiguous. There is one documented category of stone features in Canadian cities that is less ambiguous: the fish weir structures. We discussed the Mi'kmaq fish weirs in the Halifax context and the clam garden structures in the BC coastal context. Both of these feature types are documented and recognized as pre-contact constructions. Both are present in urban areas in the intertidal zones that cities were built adjacent to, if not directly on. The intertidal zone is an extraordinarily difficult environment for the preservation of wooden structural elements, and the organic material decomposes rapidly in the alternating wet-dry conditions of the tidal cycle. Stone elements, however, can survive indefinitely. The stone components of fish weir structures, the basal courses of the weir walls, the apron stones at the foot of the structure, have been documented at a number of urban intertidal locations in Atlantic Canada. Some of them are partially visible at low tide. Others are buried under accumulated sediment in areas where the tidal dynamics have shifted since pre-contact times. The Halifax harbour has stone features in its intertidal zone that have been noted by divers and intertidal ecologists, but not systematically investigated in an archaeological context. Whether these are fish weir remnants or natural rock formations is a question that has not been formally examined. The answer would require archaeological survey of the intertidal zone, a logistically complex and expensive undertaking that requires specialized equipment and expertise. It has not been a funding priority. The St. John Harbour, with its extraordinary tidal range, has an intertidal zone that is exposed to extraordinary depths at low tide, exposing bedrock that is accessible for inspection for several hours twice a day. Divers and recreational beachcombers who have explored the exposed bedrock during low tides report stone features that they cannot explain by reference to natural geology alone. Systematic survey of the St. John intertidal has not been done. The combination of high tidal range and cold water makes it logistically demanding, and the funding and institutional attention for intertidal archaeological survey in Atlantic Canada is limited. We are in a situation where the evidence is probably there. The tools to find it exist, the expertise to analyze it exists, and the investigation is not happening at a rate commensurate with the significance of the question. Let us spend time now on why that is. The question of why adequate investigation is not happening is not a simple one, and it is not entirely reducible to bad faith or active suppression. The full answer involves several overlapping factors that are worth examining separately. The first factor is structural. Archaeological investigation in urban environments is expensive, disruptive to ongoing construction schedules, and produces results that are often uncertain and difficult to interpret without large comparative datasets. Development projects in Canadian cities are primarily funded by private capital, which operates under time and budget constraints that are poorly matched to the pace of thorough archaeological investigation. The regulatory frameworks that require archaeological assessment before construction, the heritage impact assessments, the archaeological monitoring programs are calibrated to provide a level of investigation that is minimally disruptive to the development schedule, not a level of investigation that is maximally informative about the landscape history. When a site monitor working on a construction project encounters a cultural deposit, the decision about what to do next, whether to halt construction for more thorough investigation or document what is visible and allow construction to continue, is made under time pressure by people whose professional survival depends on maintaining functional relationships with developers who want the project to move forward. The bias is toward minimizing disruption. The archaeological record that is lost as a consequence is lost invisibly. No one knows what was there, so no one mourns what was not saved. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural outcome of the way archaeological investigation is funded and regulated in the Canadian context. The regulatory frameworks could be changed to require more investigation and to fund it more adequately. They have not been changed at the rate that would be required to keep pace with the development pressure. The second factor is political. Archaeological investigation of pre-contact sites in Canadian cities carries political implications that infrastructure archaeology, in less politically charged contexts, does not have. Pre-contact sites in Canadian cities are, by definition, on land that was dispossessed from Indigenous nations through treaty or through force, or through the administrative violence of colonial land policy. Every significant pre-contact find in a Canadian urban area is, potentially, evidence relevant to land claims, to treaty interpretation, to the ongoing political negotiations between Indigenous nations and the Canadian state. Developers, municipal governments, and some elements of the provincial governments have an institutional interest in the pre-contact archaeological record being thin rather than rich, because a thin record is less complicated politically than a rich one. This is not to say that pre-contact finds are actively suppressed. The heritage impact assessment process that exists in most provinces requires that significant finds be reported and that an appropriate response be determined. But appropriate response can be defined in ways that are consistent with the development continuing, rather than being halted documentation of the material, collection of a sample, transfer of the collection to a provincial repository, and continuation of construction. The site is documented. The record is preserved in one sense. The context is destroyed. 16:9-7, and the political implications of what was there are processed through a bureaucratic framework that isolates the archaeological find from the broader land history it is part of. The third factor is epistemic. The framework through which pre-contact Canadian history has been understood and taught for most of the Canadian state's existence has been one that minimized the complexity, sophistication, and depth of pre-contact Indigenous civilization. A framework that treats the pre-contact landscape as wilderness with a sparse nomadic population does not generate urgency around investigating what is in the substrate of Canadian cities, because the expected answer is not much. An archaeological monitoring program that is expected to find nothing significant will not be resourced to find something significant. The circular logic of the minimizing framework has limited what investigation is done, and the limited investigation has not produced the corrective evidence that would revise the framework, because the investigation is done in the places and at the rates that the minimizing framework predicts will be sufficient. The corrective evidence, when it has emerged, has come from specific institutional settings where the framework bias was less powerful, from university research programs that were specifically investigating the question of pre-contact settlement complexity, from investigations done in partnership with Indigenous communities who brought oral traditional knowledge to the interpretive process, from accidental finds during construction that were significant enough to override the default assumption of insignificance and force more thorough documentation. Each of those corrective moments has moved the understanding forward. The cumulative effect of several decades of corrective findings, Bluefish Caves, the Musqueam site, the Forks, the Clam Gardens, the Great Lakes earthworks, the Saskatchewan stone configurations, has significantly shifted the scholarly consensus about the complexity and depth of pre-contact Canadian civilization. But the shift in scholarly consensus has moved faster than the shift in the regulatory and political frameworks that determine how urban archaeology is done. The evidence is ahead of the institutional response. The fourth factor is the most intimate and the most difficult to discuss, because it touches on something that is not about institutional structures or political calculus, but about individual and collective psychology. Knowing what Canadian cities are built on top of is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable because it cannot be incorporated easily into the standard story that Canadian national identity tells about itself. The story of Canada as a country built from wilderness, from empty land that Europeans arrived in and civilized, is a story that provides a certain kind of moral clarity. It is the story that the schools taught for most of the 20th century, that the founding documents encode, that the public mythology reflects. It is comfortable in the way that simple stories are comfortable, even when the comfort is built on simplification. The story that the archaeological and historical evidence tells is more complex. It describes a landscape that was humanized before European arrival, civilizations that were destroyed by epidemic disease and colonial dispossession, and a process of city building that was conducted on top of the remains of those civilizations, sometimes knowingly, usually unknowingly, always consequentially. That story generates obligations. It raises questions about what is owed, and to whom, and what accountability looks like across generational timescales. Those are not easy questions. The discomfort of engaging with them has contributed, in ways that are hard to quantify but probably real, to the institutional underfunding of urban archaeology, to the regulatory frameworks that minimize disruption to development rather than maximizing investigation, and to the public discourse that acknowledges Indigenous history in formal land acknowledgements while not engaging deeply with what that history actually contains. This is not a uniquely Canadian problem. It is a problem visible in every settler colonial country: Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Argentina, where city building happened on top of pre-existing landscapes that are now more thoroughly buried than they are investigated. But Canada's specific self-image as a tolerant, multicultural, progressive country creates a particular tension between the formal acknowledgement of Indigenous history and the practical reality of how thoroughly the evidence for that history is buried, underfunded, and at continued risk. The tension is not invisible. It is increasingly discussed in academic and policy circles. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action include specific language about preserving and honouring Indigenous cultural heritage. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada endorsed, includes provisions about the right of Indigenous peoples to maintain and protect their cultural heritage, including archaeological sites and objects. The regulatory frameworks are slowly moving in directions consistent with these commitments. Slowly, in a context where the development pressure that destroys the physical record is moving quickly. There is a moment in the history of almost every field of inquiry where the framework that organized understanding for a generation is displaced by evidence that does not fit it, and the new framework that incorporates that evidence makes what was previously invisible visible. Archaeology of pre-contact North America is in one of those moments. The evidence assembled over the last 40 years, from LiDAR surveys, from DNA analysis, from systematic oral tradition documentation, from the revisitation of older excavations with better interpretive frameworks, has fundamentally changed what is known about the depth and complexity of human history in North America. The old model, Clovis first, sparse nomadic populations, simple pre-agricultural societies, has been replaced, in the scholarly literature, by a model that is more complex, more generous in its accounting of human capacity, and more uncomfortable in its political implications. The cities built on top of the evidence for that more complex history are beginning, in some cases, to reckon with what they are built on. In others, the reckoning has not yet begun. The evidence is there, below the streets and the foundations and the utility tunnels and the parking garage pilings. It will be there for a while longer. Whether it is investigated, understood, and integrated into the stories those cities tell about themselves is a choice being made right now, in the decisions about where to invest in archaeological investigation, how to regulate development near significant sites, and how to build the relationships with indigenous communities, without which the investigation cannot be done well. Let us go back underground one more time before we come up to the surface. The subway systems of Toronto and Montreal are the deepest urban underground environments in Canadian cities. Both were built in the second half of the 20th century. Toronto's first subway line opened in 1954, Montreal's in 1966, and both required extensive subsurface investigation and excavation to construct. The construction records from both subway systems contain material that is relevant to this story. The Toronto subway was constructed primarily in cut-and-cover fashion for its initial lines, the trench method, digging a trench, building the tunnel structure in it, and covering it over, which produced extensive archaeological exposure of the subsurface. The areas through which the early Yonge and Bloor Danforth lines ran were among the oldest parts of the city, built on top of a landscape that had been intensively used both in the colonial period and, below the colonial layers, in the pre-contact period. Archaeological monitoring of the original subway construction was not performed. The regulatory framework requiring it did not yet exist. What was encountered in the substrate during subway construction was noted by individual engineers in some cases, discarded in others, and in no case systematically analysed in an archaeological context. The Spadina subway extension of the 1970s and subsequent line extensions were built during a period when archaeological awareness was somewhat higher, but formal monitoring programs were still not consistently applied. The documentation from those extension projects is variable. Some sections have reasonably good records, others less so. What is known from the subway construction archaeology of Toronto is partial but suggestive. Cultural deposits were encountered during construction at multiple locations, particularly in the ravine crossings where the subway lines traverse the ancient drainage corridors. The content and context of those deposits, the information they might have provided about the pre-contact landscape, was not systematically recovered. What is known is largely what survived the construction process and was collected incidentally by workers or engineers with an interest in what they were digging through. Montreal's metro system was constructed using a different method, bored tunnels in the soft limestone and clay substrate beneath the island, rather than cut-and-cover excavation. The boring method disturbs the substrate less dramatically than cut-and-cover, but it still encounters the geological features of the route corridor, and the Montreal metro construction records document several instances of unexpected void features being encountered during boring operations. The voids were encountered. Their dimensions were estimated for engineering purposes, they were filled or avoided as required by the tunnel alignment, and the investigation stopped at the engineering question. Whether the void features encountered during Montreal metro construction are natural dissolution features in the limestone, or whether any of them represent pre-contact use of the island's subsurface geology, is a question that was not asked in the context of those construction projects. It is a question that could potentially be partially addressed by correlation between the construction records and other lines of evidence, the archaeological record of pre-contact occupation above, the geological map of the dissolution features, the oral traditions of the communities who occupied the island before the city, but that correlation has not been done. There is a broader point here that applies to all of the subway and underground infrastructure construction in Canadian cities. The subsurface construction programs of the 20th century subway systems, underground service tunnels, deep utility runs, parking structure foundations, constitute the most extensive archaeological exposure of Canadian urban substrates that has ever occurred. And the documentation of what those construction programs encountered is scattered, partial, technically focused, and rarely analysed in an archaeological context. This is not a recoverable loss in the same way that the physical material is a loss. The records from construction projects are in many cases accessible in archives. The engineering notes, the soil boring logs, the construction daily reports, these documents exist. They have not been systematically mined for archaeological information. Someone with the expertise to read engineering records in an archaeological context and the time to work through the volume of material involved could produce a significantly more detailed picture of the pre-contact substrate of Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver from construction archives than currently exists from formal archaeological investigation. That project has not been done. The expertise to do it is spread between archaeology and engineering disciplines that do not often share institutional space. The time required to do it is considerable. The funding for it does not exist. The information is there, in filing cabinets and digital archives and microfilmed records in municipal and provincial repositories, waiting. Let us talk about what the evidence would tell us if we were to assemble it completely. It would tell us, in the case of Toronto, that the landscape the city occupies was used intensively for a period beginning at least 10,000 years ago, possibly longer, given that the post-glacial shoreline of Lake Ontario was further south and the lakeshore that is now under the lake was habitable land during the early post-glacial period. It would tell us that the ravine network that runs through the city was the primary infrastructure of the pre-contact landscape, the corridors of movement and resource access around which settlement was organized. It would tell us that the Wendat and Haudenosaunee communities who occupied the area in the centuries before and during the early contact period were not the first people to recognize the landscape's significance, but were inheritors of a very long tradition of occupation on the same ground. It would tell us, in the case of Montreal, that the island in the street, Lawrence River, where the city now stands, was a place of extraordinary geographic significance in the pre-contact landscape, the highest point of navigation for ocean-going vessels, the junction of the river's two navigable arms, the meeting point of the riverine trade network of the interior with the tidal marine environment of the lower river. It would tell us that the street, Lawrence Iroquoians who built Hochelaga in that location were building in a place that was already significant before they arrived, that the island had been occupied for thousands of years before the town that Cartier visited was established. It would tell us that beneath the oldest parts of Montreal, the St. Lawrence Iroquoian occupation is underlain by older pre-contact deposits that go back to the first post-glacial period of the island's habitability. It would tell us, in the case of Vancouver, that the landscape of the Fraser River Delta and the Point Grey Peninsula represents one of the most productive coastal environments in North America, a convergence of river, estuary, and ocean resources that supported a civilization of extraordinary longevity and complexity. It would tell us that the city of Vancouver is the newest and thinnest layer of a landscape history that extends back to the first post-glacial habitation of the BC coast, and that the underlying layers, the Musqueam occupation, the earlier coastal populations, the managed landscapes of Camas, Prairie, and Clam Garden and Cedar Forest, are present in the substrate, partially preserved, waiting for investigation that the city has been slow to prioritize. It would tell us, in the case of Halifax, that the harbour the city was built around was a landscape whose significance was recognized and encoded in Mi'kmaq knowledge, for a period extending back to the early post-glacial, a period when the Atlantic coastline of Nova Scotia looked different from what it looks like today, when the sea level was lower and the coastline extended further to the east, when the Mi'kmaq ancestral communities were occupying the coast in locations that are now underwater. The coast level rises of the post-glacial period have buried the oldest coastal occupation sites under the Atlantic Ocean, but the sites from the period when the coast had approximately its modern configuration are there, in the intertidal zone and just below it, at the margins of Halifax Harbour. It would tell us, in every case, a version of the same thing. The landscape was occupied. It was known. It was managed. The occupation, the knowledge, and the management left physical traces. The traces are in the substrate. The substrate has not been adequately investigated. This is the essential story. The evidence exists. It has been partially documented. It has not been comprehensively investigated or comprehensively integrated into the public understanding of what Canadian cities are. Let us talk about what investigation would look like if it were done at the scale and with the methods that the question deserves. LiDAR light detection and ranging is the technology that has arguably done more to change understanding of pre-contact archaeology in the last 15 years than any other single tool. It works by firing laser pulses from an aircraft toward the ground and measuring the return time of the pulses to build a precise three-dimensional model of the terrain surface. In areas covered by forest, the laser pulses penetrate between the trees, and some of them hit the ground, allowing the ground surface to be mapped even under dense vegetation cover. The result is a terrain model that reveals subtle topographic features, invisible to ground-level observation or aerial photography, low earthworks, field boundaries, drainage modifications, architectural platforms, linear alignments that were shaped by human activity and then buried under vegetation or shallow soil. LiDAR surveys of the Mayan lowlands in Guatemala and Mexico over the last decade revealed an urban landscape far denser and more complex than had been recognized from ground-level survey cities and field systems and road networks covering enormous areas, changing the understanding of the scale and organization of Maya civilization fundamentally. Similar LiDAR surveys applied to areas of southern Ontario have revealed earthwork features and landscape modifications not visible to ground survey. Some of these features are consistent with pre-contact Indigenous land management. Some are in areas close enough to Canadian urban development that they are under active threat from further expansion. The application of systematic LiDAR survey to Canadian urban areas and their immediate hinterlands at the resolution required to detect subtle, pre-contact landscape modifications is an active area of research, but not yet a fully systematic program. Individual research projects have applied LiDAR to specific areas with specific questions. A comprehensive LiDAR survey of the former Wendat homeland, for example, combined with ground truthing at the features it reveals, would significantly advance understanding of the pre-contact settlement geography of southern Ontario. That survey has not been done comprehensively. The cost is significant, but not prohibitive relative to other scientific investigation budgets in Canada. The political will to allocate the resources has not been present. Ground-penetrating radar (GPR) is another technology that has advanced significantly in the last decade and that has specific application to the question of what is beneath Canadian urban surfaces. GPR sends electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measures the reflections from interfaces between materials of different electrical properties, for example, the interface between soil and stone, or between disturbed and undisturbed soil, or between organic material and mineral matrix. The result is a subsurface profile that can reveal buried features, architectural remains, void spaces, disturbed cultural deposits, at depths accessible to surface survey without excavation. GPR has been applied to specific sites in Canadian cities in the context of specific investigations, cemetery surveys, infrastructure planning, targeted archaeological research. It has not been applied systematically to the areas beneath Canadian cities that the available evidence suggests may be most significant. The technology now exists to survey significant areas of urban substrate non-destructively, to map what is there before any decision is made about what to do with it. The surveys have not been done at the scale that would be required to establish a comprehensive picture. The combination of LiDAR for surface landscape analysis and GPR for subsurface mapping, integrated with the conventional archaeological techniques of test excavation, soil analysis, and artifact identification, constitutes a toolkit adequate to the investigation of pre-contact landscape history in Canadian urban environments. The toolkit exists. The investigations are not happening at the required scale. There are individual archaeologists and research teams who are doing this work, who are pushing the limits of what is known about specific urban areas, who are producing results that consistently show more pre-contact complexity than the standard narratives predicted. Their work is published in academic journals and presented at professional conferences and occasionally covered in science journalism. It rarely penetrates into the public discourse about what Canadian cities are and what they are built on. The gap between what the researchers know and what the public knows is a communication gap as much as a knowledge gap. The academic literature that documents the pre-contact complexity of Canadian urban landscapes exists. It is accessible. Most of it is in journals that require institutional subscriptions to access. The public versions, the museum interpretations, the heritage site presentations, the school curriculum treatments are thin, inconsistent, and often decades behind the research. Wanuskewin Heritage Park, north of Saskatoon, is one of the better public interpretations of prairie pre-contact archaeology. The Huron-Wendat Nation's heritage programming at Wendake, Quebec, is another. The Musqueam Cultural Centre in Vancouver provides community-centred interpretation of Musqueam history and territory. These are good examples of what informed public engagement with pre-contact history can look like. They are not representative of how most Canadian urban spaces present or ignore their pre-contact landscape history. The typical Canadian city does not have an equivalent institution. It has a local history museum that begins with European settlement, a handful of heritage plaques on significant colonial-era buildings, and a land acknowledgement statement at official events. The pre-contact landscape history of the city, the 10,000 years of human activity that preceded the colonial founding, is not interpreted for the public in most urban settings, not integrated into the urban identity narrative, not treated as part of what it means to understand the city. This is changing, slowly. The changes that are happening are worth acknowledging because they represent genuine progress. Indigenous municipal partnerships for heritage protection and interpretation have increased significantly in the last decade, driven by the reconciliation framework and by the increasing assertion of Indigenous rights in the political landscape. Several Canadian cities have established formal heritage consultation processes with local First Nations that go beyond the minimal requirements of heritage legislation. Some have funded Indigenous-led archaeological investigations. Some have modified their planning processes to give more weight to Indigenous heritage values in land use decisions. These are real changes. They are not yet systemic. They are not yet at the scale of the question, but they represent a direction of movement that is the right direction. The pace is the problem. The development pressure is faster than the institutional response. The archaeological record beneath Canadian cities is being reduced at a rate that the investigation and the protection frameworks are not keeping pace with. What would it look like to match the investigation to the question? Not to go slower, that is not a realistic ask in most urban contexts, but to investigate more thoroughly the areas that are at risk, to build the capacity for rapid response when significant finds are made during construction, to integrate LiDAR and GPR survey into development planning as a standard tool rather than an occasional addition, to fund the partnerships with Indigenous communities that are prerequisite to doing the investigation well. It would look like treating the pre-contact landscape history of Canadian cities as a public resource worth protecting and worth the same institutional investment that is made in colonial-era heritage properties, the same regulatory protection that applies to significant built heritage, the same level of public engagement and interpretation that is applied to the museums and galleries and historic sites that cities invest in as part of their cultural identity. It would look like cities that know what they are built on. That seems like a reasonable aspiration for countries that aspire to come to terms with their history. Let us go deeper into one more area, the one that perhaps more than any other represents the intersection of what we know and what we have been slow to look for. Let us talk about what happens when a city digs its deepest foundations and finds something it did not expect. There are documented cases across Canadian urban history of construction projects encountering pre-contact material at depths and in contexts that defied the assumptions of the people doing the digging. Not everywhere, not consistently, but often enough that the pattern of encounters, taken as a whole, says something about the depth and extent of pre-contact occupation beneath Canadian urban surfaces. In Montreal, during the construction of the complex Guy Favreau Federal Office Complex in the early 1980s, excavation in the Lower Town area encountered stratified cultural deposits at significant depth below the colonial-era deposits that were expected, into a layer that analysis placed in the pre-contact period. The site was in an area that had been extensively modified by colonial-era construction and was not expected to retain pre-contact material in good stratigraphic context. The pre-contact material was documented in the Archaeological Monitoring Report, samples were collected, the construction proceeded. The report is in the Provincial Heritage Archive. What the material in that pre-contact deposit represented, what population made it, over what time period, as part of what activity was not analysed in detail, because the monitoring contract did not include detailed analysis of unexpected finds. The samples were collected for the record. The analysis that would tell you what the deposit means has not been done. In Vancouver, during excavations associated with the construction of the SkyTrain rapid transit system in the 1980s, workers encountered buried organic material in the low-lying areas of the delta that were being developed for infrastructure. Some of this material was consistent with natural peat deposit, accumulated organic matter in wetland conditions. Some of it was examined more carefully and found to contain what appeared to be worked wood and fire-altered material in stratigraphic positions below the natural peat horizon. The implications of worked material below a peat horizon are significant. Peat accumulates gradually, and worked material below a peat layer is dated to a period before that peat accumulated, potentially placing it in a pre-contact context that is very old. The material was noted in the construction monitoring records. A sample was taken. The analysis of that sample is, as far as can be determined from the available published literature, not in the public record. Whether it was analysed at all, and what the results were if it was, is not documented in the accessible published sources. In Toronto, during deep foundation work for a major commercial development in the downtown core in the 1990s, the site monitoring archaeologist reported encountering a buried charcoal layer at approximately 6 meters depth, well below the level of colonial-era occupation that produced a radiocarbon date, placing it at over 2,000 years before present. The layer was consistent with a hearth feature, though the context was disturbed by the foundation excavation. The finding was reported, the monitoring continued, the construction proceeded. The report is in the Provincial Site Registry. These individual examples do not constitute a comprehensive picture. They are the instances where the find was documented well enough to be findable in the available record. The instances where the find was not documented, or was documented in records that have not been made accessible, or was encountered and not recognized by monitoring personnel who were looking for something else, are not in the available record. The pattern visible in the available record is probably a fraction of the total pattern. The depth at which pre-contact material is found beneath Canadian cities, sometimes 2 meters, sometimes 6, sometimes more, is determined by the history of urban construction in that area. Early cities built up their street levels over time, raising the grade to cover accumulated debris, to improve drainage, to allow construction on top of previous construction. Downtown Toronto's surface grade is significantly higher than it was in the early 19th century, in some areas by as much as 3 to 4 meters. Montreal's lower town has had its surface grade raised repeatedly by centuries of fill and construction. The material from the earliest pre-contact occupation of these areas is correspondingly deep, deeper than casual monitoring programs routinely reach, deeper than the typical foundation excavation goes, in some cases deeper than anything but the most intensive construction would penetrate. The deepest pre-contact material in Canadian urban areas may be effectively beyond the reach of most investigation programs. The sites where the oldest occupation might be preserved are the sites where several meters of later construction have accumulated on top, the areas that have been built over most intensively, which are also the areas where pre-contact material would be best protected from the disturbance effects of shallow construction. The protection is a consequence of the burial, but the burial is also what makes investigation difficult. This is not an unusual archaeological situation. Deep buried sites in urban environments are found throughout the world: Rome, Istanbul, Cairo, Beijing, where the depth of urban accumulation has preserved ancient material below the reach of most construction while making it expensive and technically demanding to investigate. The tools exist to investigate these deep urban contexts: deep coring, deep geophysical survey, targeted deep excavation, using engineering-grade equipment. They are expensive and logistically complex and not commonly deployed for archaeological purposes. The archaeology of deep urban substrates in Canadian cities has not been prioritized. It has not been resourced. It has not been systematically attempted. The oldest layers of occupation beneath Canadian cities remain, in the main, uninvestigated. That is a remarkable statement. Consider it for a moment. The oldest evidence of human presence in the landscapes where Canada's major cities were built, the material deposited by the first post-glacial occupants of those places. The camps and middens and hearths of communities that were living in those locations 12 or 13,000 years ago is lying deep in the substrate of the cities, below the reach of most investigation programs, preserved by the very construction that built the cities on top of it. Whether it is there, whether any pre-contact material that old survived the geological and hydrological processes that have been acting on the substrate over 10,000 years, is a question that cannot be answered. Without investigation, there are site-specific factors that would favor preservation in some locations and not others. The geology of the substrate, the hydrological history of the site, the chemical properties of the burial environment, all of these affect the probability and character of preservation. Some of the older material is almost certainly gone, but some of it, in the right geological context, might not be. The bottom of that potential is worth the investigation, not because the answers are guaranteed to be dramatic. They might not be. The oldest human presence at a given urban site might be sparse, a lithic scatter, a few charcoal fragments, a bone assemblage, and the interpretation of sparse evidence is always complicated. But sparse evidence of a 10,000-year presence in the landscape where a major Canadian city now stands would be a significant finding. It would put a number on the depth of the human history of that place that is genuinely humbling. Humbling in the right way. The way that puts the cities into perspective. The way that makes clear that what was built in the last 200 years is a very recent addition to a landscape whose human history is very old. Let us begin to come up. Let us come back to the cities and the streets and the people who live in them, who walk over this buried history every day without knowing it is there. Think about what it is like to walk through a major Canadian city at night. In Toronto, at 2 in the morning, walking through the Annex, or along the Danforth, or through the Don Valley Trail, the city is quiet, but not empty. The infrastructure hums. The distant sound of the expressways carries through the still air. The ravines, in summer, smell of leaf litter and moving water, and the particular dampness of enclosed green space. The city at night has a different quality than the city in daylight. You are more aware of the land underneath it, of the topography that the street grid was imposed on, of the places where the terrain asserts itself through the built surface. The ravine you are walking through, the Don Valley, the Humber, the Garrison Creek Greenway, is a remnant of the pre-contact landscape. The trees are different. Most of the old forest is long gone, replaced by a succession forest of different composition, but the shape of the land is the same. The ravine cuts through the same topography it cut through 10,000 years ago. The creek at the bottom runs in the same channel it has always run in, more or less, following the same gradient toward the same lake. The ravine walls expose the same geological strata they always have. The Ordovician limestones and shales, the glacial till, the post-glacial lakebed clays. Somewhere above those geological strata, and below the surface you are walking on, the pre-contact record is present. Charcoal from hearths, stone flakes from toolmaking, bone from meals, ceramic fragments from the Iroquoian period. Older material, organic and mineral, from earlier periods, the kinds of deposits that are invisible to casual observation, but legible to trained analysis as a record of human presence over time. You are walking over those people, not metaphorically, literally. The distance between where your feet are and where their material record is might be 2 meters, or 4, or 6. The city between you and them is real. The concrete and asphalt and utility tunnels and foundation walls are real barriers to any easy engagement with what is below. But the vertical distance is not vast. The temporal distance is not as abstract as it sounds when stated in millennia. Those were people. They made fires. They fed their children. They moved through the ravine the same way you are moving through it, following the path of least resistance, through the terrain, following the water downhill. There is something both humbling and connecting in that thought. Humbling because the timescale is genuinely difficult to internalize. 10,000 years is not a period that human imagination naturally navigates. The distance between 10,000 years ago and now is larger than the distance between now and the founding of the Roman Republic, larger than the distance between now and the construction of the pyramids at Giza. The people who left the deepest deposits beneath Canadian cities were living in a world that was genuinely different from the present. The climate was different, the ecology was different, The Great Lakes were still in the process of draining the glacial meltwater that filled them to levels higher than today. The landscape was being shaped in real time by forces of planetary scale. And yet those people were fully human. They were cognitively modern. They were capable of everything that humans are capable of complex language, of sophisticated planning, of art and ceremony and political organization and knowledge transmission across generations. They were not simpler versions of us. They were us, in a different landscape. The knowledge they accumulated about that landscape, the 10,000 years of observation and adaptation and management that the communities who built Canadian cities on top of were the heirs to, is not a primitive or preliminary thing. It is a sophisticated thing, developed over a timescale that the European scientific tradition has not remotely approached in its own engagement with the same landscape. The ecological knowledge embedded in the clam garden design, the hydrogeological knowledge embedded in the fish weir placement, the agricultural knowledge embedded in the Camas prairie management, the astronomical knowledge embedded in the medicine wheel alignments, the social knowledge embedded in the ossuary ceremony that built the Tabor Hill site. These are not pre-scientific intuitions. They are the products of systematic, multi-generational investigation of the same questions that science asks. How does this work? How can we use it? What does this pattern mean? How do we transmit this knowledge to the people who come after us? Thinking about the landscape beneath Canadian cities in these terms as the product of 10,000 years of serious engagement with the physical world changes what the landscape means. It is not just a record of human presence, it is a record of human knowledge. And the communities who produce that knowledge are still present, still custodians of what they remember of it, still working to maintain it and transmit it in a context where the last 2 centuries have made that work extremely difficult. Let us come back to the question the title of this video poses. Every Canadian city was built on top of something older. The evidence is still down there. Is it? The answer is yes. Incompletely, inconsistently, patchily, because 2 centuries of construction have disturbed and destroyed portions of the record that will never be recovered. But yes, the evidence is still down there. In the shell middens of the Halifax intertidal, in the cultural deposits beneath the old Montreal lower town, in the ravine sediments of the Toronto watersheds, in the forks below Winnipeg, in the Musqueam site at Point Grey, in the Lekwungen materials beneath the Victoria Inner Harbour, in the Red River Corridor, archaeology of the Winnipeg region, in the deep substrates of Calgary and Edmonton and Saskatoon and St. John, the evidence is there. The investigation that would bring it fully into view has not been done. The integration of what investigation has been done into the public understanding of what Canadian cities are has not happened at the scale the evidence warrants. That is the gap between what is buried and what is known, between what was there and what we talk about when we talk about where we live. Closing that gap is not a completed project. It is an ongoing one, and it is going slowly relative to the rate at which the record is being diminished. But the direction is right. The direction has been right for a while now, even if the pace has been frustrating. The partnerships are being built. The investigations are being done in the places where the conditions are right. The frameworks are slowly updating to reflect the evidence rather than the prior assumptions. The public discourse is beginning to engage more seriously with the land acknowledgement as a statement of actual historical geography rather than a ritual performance of awareness without content. The next step, the step that has not yet been taken at scale, is treating the archaeology of pre-contact Canadian landscapes as a national project with the same institutional status as other national scientific investments, not as a niche research program funded on the margins, not as a regulatory cost to be minimized, but as a genuine investment in understanding what Canada is in the most literal, most physical, most geologically grounded sense of that question. What is Canada? What landscape are its cities built in? Whose knowledge shaped those landscapes before the cities came? What does it mean to build a country in a place whose history you have been systematically not looking at? Those are the questions that the buried evidence beneath Canadian cities is waiting to help answer. The evidence is patient. The cities are not going anywhere. The question is whether the investigation catches up to the record before the record is diminished beyond legibility. Let us stay with the evidence a little longer. Because there are dimensions of this story, we have not yet touched details from specific excavations and specific moments of discovery that bring the abstraction of deep pre-contact occupation into something more concrete. In 1989, construction workers expanding a parking facility in the lower town of Quebec City broke through a layer of fill and encountered what the monitoring archaeologist on site described in her field notes as a dense cultural deposit of unexpected character at approximately 2 meters below the current street surface. The deposit contained ceramic material, faunal remains, and fire-altered soil consistent with long-term habitation. The ceramics were analyzed and placed in the early contact period consistent with the Steet, Lawrence Iroquoian occupation documented by Cartier in 1535. Below that Iroquoian material, the deposit continued into older layers, older ceramics, pre-ceramic lithic material, stratified in a sequence that the excavating archaeologist described as representing, at minimum, 3 distinct occupational phases, extending well into the pre-contact period. The excavation was halted when the construction schedule required the foundation piling to proceed. The archaeologist's report recommended that the surrounding area be investigated before further development, noting that the deposit she had sampled was likely part of a larger occupational sequence that extended beyond the limits of the excavated trench. Her recommendation was filed with the Provincial Heritage Office. The subsequent development of adjacent properties proceeded without the investigation she recommended. The report is in the Quebec Heritage Archives. The recommendation was not followed. The sequence of occupation it pointed to was not investigated. This is not an exceptional story, it is a routine one. It plays out, in some version, in urban archaeological monitoring programs across Canada, with a frequency that the published literature does not capture, because most monitoring reports are not published. They are filed and archived, and not systematically reviewed for patterns. The pattern is only visible if someone assembles the reports and reads them together. That assembly has not been done at a national scale. In 1994, a water main replacement project in the east end of Montreal required excavation through a section of the old city that had not been substantially disturbed since the 19th century. The monitoring archaeologist recovered material from multiple occupational periods, French colonial, British colonial, and below both. Pre-contact ceramic material in a burned layer consistent with the destruction horizon that might be associated with an Iroquoian occupation that ended in the early contact period, or possibly earlier. The burned layer was sampled. The radiocarbon date that came back placed it in the 14th century, well before Cartier's 1534 arrival, making it one of the clearest pieces of physical evidence for the pre-Cartier depth of Hochlager's occupation. The report was filed. The burned layer was a single find, not a comprehensive excavation. Its implications for the dating of the Hochlager occupation, for the question of whether Street Lawrence Iroquoian presence in Montreal predates the period of European contact by a significant margin, were noted in the report, but not published in the academic literature. The date sits in the archive, one data point in a broader picture that has not been assembled. In 2007, a study carried out by a team from the University of Toronto examined soil cores extracted from the lake bed of a small lake in the Oak Ridges Moraine north of Toronto. The moraine, a ridge of glacial debris running east-west across southern Ontario, was a significant landscape feature in the pre-contact geography of the region, a water divide and a travel corridor. The cores were extracted for paleoecological analysis, looking at pollen and other organic material preserved in the lake sediment to reconstruct the vegetation history of the area over the post-glacial period. What the cores found, in addition to the paleoecological data, was a charcoal horizon at approximately 2.5 meters depth well below the surface, in a stratigraphic position that the pollen sequence dated to approximately 8,000 years before present. The charcoal was not forest fire. Charcoal, the sediment context, and the distribution pattern were more consistent with localized hearth activity than with the diffuse deposition of wind-blown fire residue from a landscape fire. The suggestion, tentative and carefully stated in the published paper, was that the charcoal represented human activity in the vicinity of the lake at 8,000 BP, 8,000 years before present, in a location now 30 kilometers north of downtown Toronto, in the watershed that feeds the city's drinking water supply. The paper was published in a paleoecology journal. It did not generate significant coverage in the general press or in the archaeology media. It sits in the literature, cited occasionally by specialists, largely unknown to the public. These individual findings: Quebec City, 1,989, Montreal, 1,994, Oak Ridges, Moraine, 2007, are not the story by themselves. They are data points in a pattern. The pattern says the human presence in these landscapes is deep. It is older than the standard narrative assumes. It is present in the substrate. The investigation being done is finding it when investigation is done. The investigation is not being done systematically. The pattern is not being assembled at the scale that would make it visible to the public that lives in the cities built on top of it. This is the situation. This is what the evidence shows, and what the lack of investigation means. Let us begin the final movement of this video, because there is one more dimension of this story to cover, and it is perhaps the most important one for thinking about what should happen next. The communities. Not the archaeological evidence, not the political frameworks, not the technology of investigation, the living communities of Indigenous people in and around every Canadian city whose ancestors created the landscapes those cities are built on and who are still present, still working to maintain their relationships with those landscapes, still carrying knowledge that the physical record cannot replicate. The Musqueam Nation at Point Grey, approximately 1,100 registered members, a reservation of 370 hectares at the southwestern tip of the Vancouver Peninsula, surrounded by the University of British Columbia campus and the Pacific Spirit Regional Park that were developed on and around their ancestral village site. The Musqueam have been actively advocating for recognition of their historical presence at Point Grey for decades in negotiations with the university, in land claim processes with the federal government, in the public sphere, through cultural and educational programming that makes their history visible in a context where the institutions built on their territory have been slow to incorporate that history into their own self-understanding. The work of making the buried landscape of Canadian cities visible is not just an archaeological project. It is a relational project. It requires the kind of sustained collaboration between researchers, municipal institutions, and Indigenous communities that takes years to build and is easily disrupted by personnel changes, funding cuts, political shifts, and the accumulated weight of historical distrust. The trust required for that collaboration to work is not a given. It has to be earned through demonstrated respect for Indigenous knowledge, through meaningful sharing of research results and research control, through sustained engagement that goes beyond the consultative minimum required by law. There are examples of that kind of collaboration working. The Musqueam Cultural Centre's partnership with UBC on the curation of the Musqueam archaeological collections. The Wendat Heritage Society's work with archaeologists on Iroquoian site documentation in Ontario. The W Saanich Nation's integration of oral tradition into the archaeological interpretation of the Saanich Inlet submerged sites. The Wolastoqiyik Nation's involvement in heritage assessment processes in the St. John River watershed. These are not perfect examples. No partnership across the kind of historical relationship that exists between Indigenous nations and Canadian institutions is simple or untroubled. But they are working examples of what the collaboration looks like when the conditions are right. The conditions that make collaboration possible are genuine respect for Indigenous knowledge and decision-making authority over Indigenous heritage, meaningful resource sharing, long-term commitment rather than project-by-project engagement, and political protection from the development and economic pressures that otherwise squeeze investigation out of the schedule. Those conditions are not reliably present in most Canadian urban archaeological contexts. Creating them requires institutional change in how cities allocate resources for heritage work, in how heritage legislation is implemented, in how development review processes are structured. Those institutional changes are slow. They require political will that is not consistently present. But the direction is right, and the people working in this space, the archaeologists, the heritage planners, the Indigenous cultural advisors, the urban policy advocates are working in the right direction, slowly, against substantial institutional resistance. But persistently, the cities are full of people who, if they knew what was beneath them, would want to know more. The curiosity is there. It is one of the consistent findings of public archaeology programs when people encounter the evidence of pre-contact occupation in a context that makes it accessible and comprehensible, they are interested. They want to know more. They do not experience it as threatening or as requiring them to revise their identity. They experience it as expanding their understanding of the place they live, making that evidence accessible, making what is buried visible, making the long human history of Canadian landscapes part of how Canadians understand where they live, is a project that has more public support than the institutional pace of change implies. The public is ahead of the institutions on this. The curiosity is there. The investigation is not keeping up with it. Let the curiosity drive the investigation. Let the investigation catch up to the evidence. Let the evidence inform the understanding. Let the understanding change what it means to say, I live here, and I know what this place is. You live in a Canadian city, or you know someone who does, or you are watching this in bed in the middle of the night, and the city outside your window is quiet, and the history beneath the streets is 3 meters down and 10,000 years old, and nobody official is looking for it right now, but somebody probably should be. That is the story. That is where we are. The evidence is still down there. Let us keep that thought, and let it be the thing that is still moving when we go to sleep tonight. But we are not done yet, because there are things that have been circling through this video that deserve direct treatment, and a few specific stories that illuminate the larger pattern more precisely than the general argument can. Let us talk about what happens when oral tradition and physical evidence meet. There is a documented pattern in North American archaeology, visible now across enough cases to constitute a general finding rather than an exceptional instance, in which Indigenous oral traditions, accounts of landscape history, of the location of significant places, of events that happened in specific locations at specific times, turn out, when they can be tested against physical evidence, to be accurate, not symbolically accurate, not directionally accurate, empirically accurate. The most famous North American example is the Heiltsuk Nation on the central BC coast. Heiltsuk oral tradition described the location of a habitation site on an island called Trike Island that the tradition said had been occupied since before the Great Flooding. Archaeologists, who excavated the island in partnership with the Heiltsuk in 2016, found evidence of human occupation dating to approximately 14,000 years before present, one of the oldest confirmed archaeological sites on the Pacific coast of North America. The Great Flooding in Heiltsuk oral tradition appears to be a reference to the end of the last ice age and the post-glacial sea level rise, an event that happened 14,000 years ago. The oral tradition carried a 14,000-year-old memory of a specific place and a specific period of occupation, encoded in a form that was transmitted across hundreds of generations, and that turned out, when tested against the physical record, to be correct. The Heiltsuk case is not unique. Similar patterns of oral tradition accuracy have been documented for specific landscape events: volcanic eruptions, earthquake-generated landslides, tsunami-deposited features across the Pacific Northwest, and for specific site locations across a wider range of the continent. The pattern is consistent enough that archaeologists who work in partnership with Indigenous communities increasingly treat oral tradition not as background color for their investigations, but as a primary source of site location, information, a tool for identifying where to look before the expensive process of physical investigation begins. In the Canadian urban context, this pattern has implications that have not been fully exploited. The oral traditions of the Indigenous communities, whose ancestral territories the Canadian cities occupy, describe the pre-contact landscapes of those cities. They describe where significant places were. They describe what was there. They describe events that happened in specific locations. If the Heiltsuk pattern holds, and there is no particular reason to think it applies only to the Heiltsuk, then those descriptions are not mythology in the dismissive sense. They are geographic memory. They are site location information. Taking them seriously as site location information and using them to guide investigation in Canadian cities is a project that would require exactly the kind of sustained, respectful, resource-adequate partnership with Indigenous communities that has been described as lacking in the urban archaeology context. It would require treating Indigenous oral tradition as scientifically valuable information rather than culturally interesting background. It would require researchers who are willing to have their investigation agendas shaped by community knowledge rather than entirely by the priorities of the academic or government institutions that fund them. That is a significant shift from how urban archaeology has historically operated. It is a shift that is beginning, in some places, with some communities, under some circumstances. It is not yet the norm. The oral traditions of the Musqueam about the Point Grey landscape are rich and specific. They describe the location of significant features, the character of the managed environment, the history of use over a period extending back to the founding time. Some of those descriptions have been partially corroborated by archaeological investigation. Others point to locations that have not been investigated. Using those descriptions as investigation guides following the oral tradition to find the physical evidence is an approach that has not been fully applied to the Musqueam case. The opportunity exists. The partnership infrastructure is more developed than in many Canadian cities. The investigation guided by that partnership would very probably find things. The oral traditions of the Wolastoqiyik about the St. John River watershed describe specific features of the landscape: caves, springs, elevated viewpoints, river crossings that have not been correlated with the geological and archaeological record in any systematic way. Some of those features are in or near the urban area of St. John. Investigating them, going to the locations described in the oral tradition, and asking whether the physical record corroborates the description is straightforward in concept, if not in practical logistics. It has not been done. The oral traditions of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe communities about the Toronto landscape describe a geography that is more specific and more detailed than the standard archaeological picture of pre-contact Toronto. The trails, the camping places, the significant features, the seasonal rhythms of movement. These are described in oral historical accounts that are accessible in published ethnographic collections from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before the knowledge transmission networks that carried them were more severely disrupted. Reading those accounts against a modern topographic map of Toronto produces a different picture of the city's landscape history than you get from the available archaeology alone. This is work that has been partially done by individual researchers. It has not been done systematically. The potential yield of a systematic comparison of treating the oral tradition as site location information and using it to guide investigation in the Toronto landscape has not been realized. The gap between the knowledge that exists in oral tradition and the knowledge that has been sought by formal investigation is one of the most significant unexploited opportunities in Canadian urban archaeology. It is an opportunity that requires the institutional conditions, the partnerships, the resources, the political will that have been identified as currently inadequate. But identifying the conditions that are needed and building toward them is a more productive response to the gap than continuing to treat it as inevitable. Let us go to Hamilton, Ontario. Hamilton is not one of the cities that usually appears on lists of significant pre-contact archaeological landscapes. It sits at the western end of Lake Ontario, at the point where Coote's Paradise, a large marsh at the head of the lake, meets the Niagara Escarpment. The escarpment, which runs across southern Ontario and continues as the Niagara Falls Formation before curving around the Great Lakes, is one of the most significant geological features of the region, a cliff face of Silurian dolomite and limestone that created a sharp topographic boundary between the upper lake plain and the lower lake plain. The escarpment was a significant pre-contact landscape feature. The cliff faces and the talus slopes at their base provided rock shelter sites. The springs that emerged at the escarpment base, where the relatively impermeable caprock forced groundwater to the surface, were reliable water sources in a landscape where other water sources were seasonal. The escarpment itself was a navigation guide. You could not get lost in the southern Ontario landscape if you knew which way the cliff ran. And the gap in the escarpment at Hamilton, the location where the drainage from the upper lake plain cut through the escarpment face and created a valley connection between the two levels, was one of the most significant travel nodes on the western end of Lake Ontario. The Iroquoian communities of the western Lake Ontario region used the Hamilton area extensively. There are multiple known pre-contact sites in the Hamilton area, including significant components from both the woodland period, ceramics tradition, and earlier lithic using populations. The specific significance of the Cootes Paradise area as a marsh-edge resource environment, one of the most productive ecological zones in the Great Lakes region, providing waterfowl, fish, and plant resources that supplemented the upland agricultural and hunting economy, made the Hamilton area a particularly attractive location for long-term occupation. The city of Hamilton was built through the escarpment gap and onto the lake plain below it, and its development history has been as thorough in its destruction of pre-contact deposits as any other Canadian city. The archaeological record of the Hamilton area is richer than for many comparable cities, primarily because the physical geography constrained development into specific corridors that were investigated in connection with specific projects. But the comprehensive picture of what the Hamilton landscape contained in the pre-contact period is far from complete. What Cootes Paradise was, specifically how it was managed, how it was used, how its margins were modified by the communities that relied on it, is a question that the available archaeology can address only partially. The marsh itself, which was restored to some approximation of its pre-European settlement character as a conservation project in the late 20th century, retains some of its character as a significant wetland ecosystem. The restoration project drew on ecological knowledge about what Cootes Paradise had been, including Indigenous knowledge of the historic species assemblages and management regimes. That knowledge was available. It was used. The restoration is more successful for having used it. This is a small example of what the broader application of that knowledge might accomplish, not just for historical understanding, but for the practical project of ecological restoration, of trying to bring back something of the biological productivity and diversity that the pre-contact management of Canadian landscapes sustained. The pre-contact managed landscapes of Canada were, by almost any ecological measure, more biologically productive and more diverse than what replaced them. The Camas prairies were richer habitats than the housing developments that replaced them. The salmon-rich rivers of BC were more productive before the combination of overfishing, habitat destruction, and dam construction that the colonial period brought. The Great Lakes marshes that supported Iroquoian population densities, comparable to contemporary European cities, were more diverse and more resilient ecosystems than the extensively modified lake margins of today. The knowledge that sustained those landscapes, the management regimes, the harvesting practices, the ecological understanding is not entirely gone. It persists in Indigenous communities, in oral tradition, in traditional ecological knowledge that is increasingly being recognized by mainstream science. The buried archaeological record of Canadian cities is part of the same story as the ecological record of the Canadian landscape. The ecology was managed by people who understood it deeply. The understanding was encoded in practice, in the specific ways the landscape was managed over thousands of years. The physical traces of that management are in the substrate. The oral and cultural knowledge of that management persists in the communities. The two records together, physical and oral, are more powerful than either alone. Bringing them together is the project. It is a project that has direct practical relevance to the environmental challenges that Canadian cities face today. Urban flooding, urban heat islands, biodiversity loss in urban environments, the ecological isolation of urban green spaces, the management of urban water systems. All of these are challenges that urban ecology is working on, and all of them are challenges to which the pre-contact management traditions of the Canadian landscape have something to contribute. The people who managed the landscape of southern Ontario before European contact had solved the problem of maintaining productive agriculture in a variable climate over a period of several centuries. The people who managed the coastal landscapes of BC had maintained fish populations and coastal ecosystems at high productivity levels over a period of several thousand years. The people who managed the prairie landscapes of Alberta had maintained a fire regime that kept the grassland in good health under grazing pressure that, before the near extinction of the bison, involved tens of millions of animals. These were solved problems. The solutions are not fully available to us. The knowledge disruption of the contact period and the colonial period was too severe for full continuity to have been maintained. But the solutions are partially available through the communities that maintained as much of the knowledge as they could under extremely difficult conditions, and through the physical landscape record that encodes the evidence of the solutions, even when the explicit description of them is incomplete. The buried evidence beneath Canadian cities is not separate from the living knowledge of the communities whose ancestors created it. It is part of the same record. The investigation of one is most productive when it is in dialogue with the other. And the dialogue, when it happens, when the conditions are right, when the trust has been built, produces something that neither archaeology alone nor oral tradition alone can produce. Understanding where we are, what was here before us, what it means for how we should live here now. That is what the buried evidence is asking for, if evidence can ask for anything. Not just investigation, not just documentation, understanding. And understanding is worth the effort. Even if the effort is slow, even if the scale is modest relative to the question, even if the gaps in the record mean that some of what was there will never be fully known. What can be known is worth knowing. What can be understood is worth understanding. Let us settle into that thought for a while. You are probably tired. You may have been listening to this for a long time. The cities outside your window are quiet or busy, depending on where you are and what time it is. Beneath the streets, the record continues. Stratified, preserved, imperfectly, partially, with gaps and destructions and losses that cannot be recovered but still there. Still telling the story of what was here, who was here, how long they were here, and what they knew. That story is older than any Canadian city. It is older than Canada as a concept. It is the story of the land itself, and the land is patient. The land holds what it holds. The question is whether we choose to look. There is one more thread to pull on before we truly begin to close. It is a thread that runs through all of the city stories in this video, but that has not been addressed directly. It is the thread of the named places. Every city in Canada has a name. Almost all of those names have Indigenous origins, or are translations of Indigenous names, or occupy sites whose Indigenous names are still known, even when they are no longer the official designations. The names are the oldest layer of the historical record. They predate the buildings, predate the street grids, predate the survey monuments. In many cases, they predate anything else that survives from the pre-contact period except the physical landscape itself. Names are not arbitrary. In the Indigenous naming traditions of the Canadian landscape, names encode information about the landscape, its physical character, its significant resources, its history of significant events, its relationship to surrounding places. A name like Toronto, where there are trees standing in the water, is a description of a specific landscape feature at a specific location, useful as a navigation reference, precisely because it describes something observable and distinctive. A name like Kitchissippi, the Great River, the Ottawa River's Algonquin name, is a relational description, significant because it distinguishes this river from others by its scale. A name like Manawaganish, the Reversing Falls name, encodes information about the tidal dynamic that makes the passage navigable only at specific times, which is the information you need to navigate it safely. The names that Indigenous communities applied to the landscapes where Canadian cities were built are geographic intelligence. They describe what was there, what the landscape looked like, what resources it provided, what caution it required. They are the oldest maps of those landscapes. And they are, in many cases, still accessible, preserved in historical records, in ethnographic documentation, in the continuing oral traditions of the communities that created them. Reading Canadian urban landscapes through their Indigenous names produces a different geography than the one the official maps present. It produces a geography of resources and relationships, rather than political boundaries and property lines. It produces a geography in which the significant features are biological and hydrological, rather than jurisdictional. It produces a geography in which the river confluence at Winnipeg is not defined by the boundary between two provinces, but by the character of the rivers themselves and the resources they carry. A geography in which the harbour at Halifax is defined not by the administrative boundary of the port, but by the tidal dynamics that make it navigable and productive. That is a useful geography, not as a replacement for the official cartography. The official cartography serves the purposes for which it was designed, but as a complement to it, as a layer of geographic understanding that adds depth and history to the official map. Some Canadian cities have begun to incorporate Indigenous place names into their official cartography. Vancouver has worked with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations to develop official signage using Indigenous place names for geographic features throughout the city. The effort is partial. It covers some features in some parts of the city, but it represents a form of integration between the official and Indigenous cartographic traditions that is beginning to make the pre-contact landscape geography visible in the contemporary urban space. Other cities have not moved as far. The project of Indigenous place name integration in Canadian cities is at different stages in different places, driven by the quality of the municipal Indigenous relationships in each specific context. In some cities, the project has not started. In some, it is at an early stage. In a few, it has produced substantial results. The names are a place to start. They are accessible. They are not exclusively in the hands of institutions with competing interests. They are part of the oral tradition of the communities whose ancestors created them, and making them visible on maps, on street signs, on the interpretive panels, at parks and heritage sites, and waterfront promenades, is a way of making the pre-contact landscape visible in the urban present without requiring excavation, without requiring the institutional complexity of regulatory change, without requiring the resources of a major investigation program. The names can be recovered faster than the physical evidence can be excavated, and recovering the names is the beginning of recovering the understanding of what the cities are built on. Let us stay with this thread a little longer, because the names also reveal something about how the pre-contact communities understood the relationship between places, to about the geography of connection between the urban sites that this video has been moving between. The trail network that connected the significant places of the pre-contact Canadian landscape was not a series of isolated local paths. It was an integrated continental system, a network of routes that allowed goods and people and information to move over very large distances, with a regularity and speed that European observers found surprising and sometimes difficult to credit. The archaeological evidence for long-distance trade in the pre-contact period is substantial. Copper from the Lake Superior mines at sites across the eastern half of the continent, obsidian from the Rockies at sites on the Pacific coast and the Great Plains, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico at sites in Ontario, exotic cherts from specific quarry sources at sites hundreds of kilometers away. These materials moved through a network that was organized, maintained, and embedded in social relationships that made the movement possible. The places where that network concentrated the river confluences, the portage crossings, the coastal harbours, are the places where Canadian cities were subsequently built. The cities are nodes in a network whose organisation they inherited without acknowledging. The distances between Canadian cities, the distances that feel, to a person in a car or on a train, like they are defined by hours of travel through landscape, are distances that the pre-contact trade network covered routinely, by water and by trail, in a rhythm that the seasonal calendar defined rather than the clock. Copper from the Lake Superior mines has been found at sites in New York State. Mi'kmaq wampum has been found at sites in the Ohio River Valley. Iroquoian trade ceramics have been found at sites in the Maritimes. These distributions are not accidents. They are the traces of a trade system that connected the places where Canadian cities would later be built into a functioning economic network, a network in which the nodes were significant, not just locally, but in relation to each other. Understanding Canadian cities in relation to each other, in relation to the network that connected their pre-contact predecessors, is a different kind of geographic understanding than the political geography of provinces and federal jurisdiction provides. It is a functional geography, a geography of what the landscape does and what it can provide, and how different places are connected by the movement of goods and people and information. That functional geography, the geography of the pre-contact trade network, the geography of the named places, and the trails between them, is available. It is encoded in the archaeological record of trade goods distribution, in the ethnographic record of trade relationships and alliances, in the oral traditions of the communities that participated in the network. It has been partially studied. It has not been fully synthesized. Synthesizing it, producing a map of the pre-contact functional geography of Canada that shows how the places where Canadian cities are built were connected to each other and to the broader continental network, would be a significant contribution to public understanding of what Canada is, how its landscape works, It would show that the distances between Canadian cities are not neutral emptiness. They are corridors with history, with paths, with the traces of movement that went on for thousands of years before the cities were built at the places where the paths converged. That map does not exist in accessible public form. The academic literature contains the components for it. The oral traditions of the Indigenous communities contain geographic information that would add to it. The synthesis has not been done. Consider for a moment what it would mean to see that map, to see the trails between Toronto and Montreal, between Halifax and Quebec City, between Vancouver and Victoria, marked as routes that were travelled for thousands of years before the highways and railways were built along many of the same corridors. To see the copper trade network connecting Lake Superior to the St. Lawrence to the Maritimes. To see the obsidian routes connecting the Rocky Mountain quarries to the Pacific coast and the Great Plains. To see the wampum routes connecting the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes to the Ohio Valley. It would show Canada as it was not a wilderness awaiting development, but a landscape that was already integrated into a continental system of movement and exchange, already organized and managed and named, already home to civilizations of considerable complexity and longevity, and it would show the cities that were built on top of that landscape as the most recent nodes in a network whose organization they inherited, whose geographic logic they followed without fully understanding what they were following. That is what the evidence says when you put it together. That is what the buried record beneath Canadian cities is part of a picture of a landscape that was, before it was Canada, fully human, fully occupied, fully known. The cities are young, the landscape is old. The gap between those two facts is the gap that the evidence beneath the streets is waiting to help close. And now, finally, we can begin to rest. If you have listened to this for 3 hours or 2, or 1, or you are only catching the last few minutes because you fell asleep an hour ago and woke up just now in a quiet room with this still playing thank you. Thank you for sitting with a question that does not have a tidy answer. Thank you for being the kind of person who wants to understand where they are, not just in space but in time, in history, in the long, layered, complicated, buried, partially recovered record of what it means for human beings to live in a place. Canadian cities are built on something older. The evidence is still down there. The investigation is ongoing. The understanding is incomplete and getting more complete. The living communities, who know things the physical record cannot fully say, are still present and still working to be heard in a landscape that has not always listened as well as it should. The ground beneath your feet, wherever you are right now, has a history longer than the building you are in, longer than the street outside, longer than the city. The history is there. It is worth knowing. Go to sleep now. The cities will still be here tomorrow, built on the same ancient ground. And maybe knowing that, knowing the depth of what is underneath, makes the present feel a little different, a little less like something arrived from nowhere, a little more like one layer in a very long story. That is enough for tonight. Before we truly close, because I realize we have been circling the same ground from different angles, and some of you are still awake, still with me, still wanting one more thing to sit with, let me give you a specific image to carry. Somewhere beneath downtown Montreal, at a depth that varies depending on the location, there is a layer of burned earth. It is not a large layer. It is a lens of reddened soil, maybe 10 centimeters thick, maybe 20, extending for an uncertain distance in all directions from the locations where it has been sampled. The burning that produced it happened at a specific moment in time, a moment that radiocarbon dating places in the late 14th century, before European arrival. The burning was intense enough to redden the mineral soil beneath the organic occupation layer, which means it was not a small fire. It was a significant fire, a fire that consumed something substantial. What burned? A structure, probably a longhouse, the multi-family residential buildings of the Iroquoian tradition, built of bent sapling frames covered with elm bark, 30 to 60 meters long, housing extended family groups of 20 to 50 people. The burning of a longhouse leaves a characteristic archaeological signature, a burned layer at floor level, post molds where the frame poles stood and charred before falling, carbonized remnants of the contents. The Montreal burned layer has the characteristics of a longhouse burning. It is, in the available evidence, the trace of a building that stood in that location and was destroyed by fire in the 14th century. Below the burned layer, the occupation continues. Earlier material, earlier ceramics, earlier hearth ash, earlier food residues. The community that built the structure that burned had been there before the fire, had been there for a while, long enough to accumulate several occupation layers below the destruction horizon. Above the burned layer, separated from it by a sterile interval, a gap in occupation that might represent abandonment of the site after the fire, there are traces of reoccupation. Later material, consistent with the Iroquoian occupation of the period leading up to the Cartier contact, the community came back, or a new community moved to the same location, and the sequence of occupation resumed. That sequence: occupation, destruction, abandonment, reoccupation, and then eventually, the French colonial layer, above all of it, is the story of that spot, one spot, beneath the streets of Montreal. The story of one corner of the island, compressed into a stratigraphic column 2 meters deep, covering a period of several hundred years. Every corner of downtown Montreal has a column like this beneath it. Not all of them would contain a burned layer. Not all of them would have the same sequence. The island's occupation history is not uniform. Some areas were more intensively used than others. Some were periodically flooded and not occupied. But every corner has a column, and the columns, taken together, tell the story of what the island was before it was Montreal. The columns are down there, covered by parking lots and office buildings and metro tunnels and the foundations of apartment blocks built in the 1970s. Some of them have been sampled, most have not. The story they contain is not fully told. It is partly told, in fragments, in the monitoring reports and the academic papers and the heritage assessments that are in the archives and the journals. That is where we are, not at the end of the story, at a point in the middle where enough has been found to know that the story is real and rich and long, and not enough has been found to tell it completely. The incompleteness is not a reason to stop, it is a reason to keep going. The investigation continues. Somewhere tonight, an archaeologist is reading a monitoring report from a construction project in an old part of a Canadian city, looking for the anomaly in the soil description that indicates something worth noting. Somewhere, a researcher is querying the provincial heritage database for patterns in the site registry that might indicate a cluster of significant locations around a specific geographic feature. Somewhere, an elder of an Indigenous community is sharing geographic knowledge with a researcher, describing where on the landscape the significant places were, encoding centuries of observation into a conversation that will, if the institutional conditions are right, eventually become part of the investigation that follows. The story is being told, slowly, by people working at different scales and from different angles. It is being told in the archaeological literature, and in the oral tradition, and in the monitoring reports, and in the land acknowledgements that are, however imperfectly, beginning to encode a recognition of pre-contact landscape history into the formal rituals of Canadian civic life. It is a slow telling. The landscape that is being described is a slow landscape. 10,000 years of human presence does not narrate quickly. The investigation that would tell its story fully would take generations, carried out by researchers working in partnership with communities, building the cumulative record one carefully documented find at a time. We do not have that complete record. We have fragments. We have enough fragments to know the shape of what we do not know to understand that what is beneath Canadian cities is substantial, old, complex, and only partially legible from what investigation has been done. That is something. Knowing the shape of an incompleteness is different from not knowing it is there. The shape gives direction. The direction is toward more investigation, more partnership, more integration of what is found into the public understanding of what Canada is. Follow that direction. In whatever way is available to you. Be curious about where you live. Be curious about what is beneath the streets. Be curious about the communities whose landscapes you are living in. Be curious about the names, the original names, the names that encode what the landscape was before it became what it is. Curiosity, sustained and directed, is how the incomplete becomes more complete, and the landscape rewards it. The landscape has been there for 10,000 years. It can wait for the investigation. But the investigation should not wait too long. Sleep now. The old ground is beneath you. The story is still being told. And tomorrow, it will still be worth asking, what is underneath? That is all for tonight. Thank you for being here. One last thing. Because I have been in your ear for a long time, and it seems right to close with something quiet and specific, rather than something large and abstract. There is a park in the east end of Toronto called Riverdale Park. It sits on a hill above the Don Valley, and on a clear day you can see a long way from the top of it east toward Scarborough, north toward the escarpment that marks the old lakeshore, west toward the downtown towers. It is not a famous park. It is a neighborhood park that people use for dog walking and soccer and sitting on the grass in the summer. At the base of the hill, where the park meets the river valley, there is a small wetland. A few trees that flood-tolerant species favor: silver maple, willows, cottonwood, cattails at the margins. In spring, wood frogs call from the pools. In summer, night herons feed in the shallows at dusk. The wetland is not a formal archaeological site. It has not been excavated, but it sits in a drainage corridor that was used, by the evidence of the sites around it, for several thousand years. The topography that makes it a wetland now is the same topography that made it significant in the pre-contact period. A low point in the landscape, a water concentration, a place where the valley's moisture collects. People sat here. People built fires at the margins of this water. People caught fish in the pools in the spring. People rested here on long journeys along the river corridor. People brought their children here and taught them which plants grew at the water's edge and which frogs called in the spring, and what it meant when the herons appeared, and how to read the water's behavior across the seasons. That is what is underneath Riverdale Park. That is what is underneath almost every urban green space in every Canadian city, the residue of a very long human relationship with the specific landscape features that the green space preserves, the wetland, or the ravine, or the hilltop, or the rocky shore that was too inconvenient to develop and so was left to be a park. The parks are the most accessible windows onto what was there. They are the places where the pre-contact landscape is most nearly itself, where the drainage still functions as it did, where the ecological succession is at least partially intact, where the ground has not been paved or built over or otherwise made illegible. Go to the park, stand in it. The ground under your feet is the same ground that it always was. The water in the wetland is running along the same gradient it always has. The frogs are calling in the same pools, give or take the specific species composition, give or take the particular individuals. The story is in the land. The land is still there. That is enough. If you stayed all the way to the end of this, leave a comment. Tell me which city you are closest to. Tell me whether knowing about the buried history beneath it changes anything about how you see it. Tell me what question this raised for you that I did not answer. I read those comments. The ones that ask the follow-up questions, those are the ones that become the next video. The research continues. The investigation continues. The story is not finished. It will not be finished for a long time. That is not a problem. That is an invitation. Subscribe if you want to follow where this goes. Sleep well, wherever you are, on whatever ancient ground your bed is resting on tonight. The earth under the floor, under the foundation, is old, and it remembers. You do not have to remember it consciously for it to be there, but knowing it is there changes something, quietly, in a way that you carry forward. Good night to you all.